Yeehaw, everybody, and welcome back to the Jank Tank, episode number 18. My name is Timothy Zaccanino. I'm going to be hosting for you today for our Outlaws of Thunder Junction Cube review. I have with me on the line both of the boys, Christopher Sofsky and Teld, also colloquially known in the community as Maul and Paul. I'll let you determine who's who. How are we doing? We ready to talk some Cowboys, Lassos, Spurs, whatever else is going on in this set?
Tim, that Yeehaw was so unenthused. It was
yeah. Okay, so I record next to a dorm room where people are presumably sleeping at this point, so I can't be that loud. I practiced the Yeehaw a little bit, but I was like, let's just do a quiet Yeehaw.
They're college students. They're not people. I wouldn't worry about it.
A subdued Yeehaw. I can try again at some point, but it won't be right now. If you wanna Yeehaw for us, like, you're more than welcome to.
Yeehaw!
That was actually pretty good. Teld is showing a significantly more enthusiasm this morning than I am. I honestly, this is the Wild West set, but I also feel like this describes me in this moment very well. I'm feeling ornery right now. So expect some hateful takes, expect some, misdirected sarcasm.
Is it because you have all those teeth and no toothbrush?
It's actually because I'm full of bullets. I'm very bad at dueling, but I'm an angry person, so I just keep getting shot.
I think I might be the most enthusiastic person in the entire Magic community about this set. I have mentioned that I've been waiting for this one for a long time, and I'm going to be honest, for me, it is delivered. 10 out of 10, baby.
Yeah, I like it too. But...
There's a whole range of people that are annoyed for different reasons, some significantly more stupid than others. I don't know if we should touch that in this conversation, probably, but I have opinions. Basically, like, if you have strong opinions about what the set did or did not historically address, then I would highly encourage you to dig deep within yourself, find any glimmer of an actual personality that you may possess, grip it as tight as you can with your index finger and your thumb, and just start tugging at it until something comes out. That's my life advice for today. If you're up in arms about this set, I think you should examine yourself and how much you have going on. Anyway.
Yeah, I'm actually glad WotC decided not to touch any, or at least on the surface, didn't seem to touch any social issues or, like, historical grievances or anything.
Like, why?
I think that was actually,
it's a toy for children. Like, this is a toy for children at the end of the day. Like, do you want to come out with, like, Custer's Last Stand Barbie? Like, what do you want? Anyway.
Yeah, well, that and, like, the story, let's be honest, if they had done it, people would just be complaining that they had done it poorly. Right? Because the WotC doesn't tell good stories. So the fact that they don't tell good stories anymore is, like, I think that's a good justification to just have fun.
Speaking of WotC not telling good stories, there's, like, another element of the community, like the Vorthos element of the community that's, like, the story is, like, so, like, unsubstantial, and it's like, WotC's stories always are. Like, why are you angry? Like, I don't see what the delta is here. I'm actually interested to know, like, what percentage of the Magic community is, like, really, really involved in the progression of the story. It's probably higher than I think it is, because I'm in my little Magic echo chamber where all we care about is whether or not cards are keepable. But, like, are we really worried about what happens to Jace next?
Look, if you really want to go enjoy some sort of dark, gritty Western, go play Red Dead Redemption 2 or go watch The Unforgiven or something. There's plenty of, like, dark Western media for you. This is, like, when they announced it, this was sold as a silly romp that was going to be, the Outlaws doing a big bad, and we had, like, Rakdos flying around with, like, tiny bones in the picture, It's like, we knew, Tim, you said it best. It was like something along the lines of, like, hey, this is what we advertise. It's going to be a fun little romp with the bad boys.
This set, what we have seen of it, is exactly what they said it was going to be when it was revealed like a year ago or whatever on that panel. They said this is a Western-themed set where all of the multiverse's bad guys are going to show up on a lawless plane, and then during spoiler season, all of the multiverse's bad guys showed up on a lawless plane wearing cowboy hats. The response on Twitter, which obviously is like fake clout chasing for most people, it has been like either the set is like too much of a caricature with like all of the different legends they pulled out of nowhere, which, like, fair. They really did dig pretty deep.
Bit.
Yeah, they dug pretty deep. But also a lot of people are like, this is disrespectful to like what a Western's supposed to be. Like there's this card called Boombox that's like a TNT crate with like horseshoes on it, and they're like, look how lazy they're being. There are horseshoes all over it. Did you need any indication that this was a Western set? Like Wizards doesn't know how to handle this. And it's like, just please, just shut up.
You know what they should have done? They should have reprinted Grizzly Bears. Except in the art, it's a grizzly bear just mauling the shit out of Leonardo DiCaprio from The Revenant. You guys remember that scene?
Yeah.
This is like in the last set. It'd be like complaining that Private Eye was so lazy because he's just a big eye detective. It's just like the lowest IQ take. It's like, dude, it's meant to be a pun. Get over it.
I like seeing the Magic designers have fun with stuff like this. And I think people are expecting like this back and forth of like, here's a dark set and here's a lighthearted set and here's a dark set and here's a lighthearted set. And we just got like the set where everybody was roaming around in detective hats, and now they're all roaming around in cowboy hats. So I get
and then they're gonna be roaming around with cute little squirrel caps, and then we got top hats. Come on, let's go!
I said this on Twitter, but at this rate, they're gonna start Bloomborough previews in a couple months, and people are gonna be like, "This set is full of nothing but squirrels and raccoons." It's gonna be like, well, no shit. All right, I did want to ask real quick before we get into the logistics here. Are you guys Western fans at all?
Oh yeah,
I've enjoyed some modern Westerns for sure. I'm not one of those guys who like goes back and watches John Wayne movies or anything.
I need to go back and watch through all the John Wayne stuff, but I'm a big fan of the genre, like any sort of like media that is like that adjacent, that's like telling a Western style story. I tend to enjoy. Probably like one of my higher end, like in terms of non-fantasy aesthetics, it's definitely up there.
Gotcha. All right, logistically, let's talk about this set real quick. Yes, it's the Wild West set. That's more of a backdrop to the like, this is the place where villains come to gather, Omen Path arc type thing, which we obviously don't know enough about the lore to like talk about it in depth. But logistically, for the purposes of our cube review today, there are a couple things to know about Outlaws of Thunder Junction. The set is very loaded with some extra stuff going on. So there's like multiple bonus sheets flying around. And one thing to note is that this set was supposed to have an Aftermath style epilogue similar to March of the Machine. But that set was such a commercial failure that they said something along the lines of they repurposed the Aftermath set by including a lot of those cards in the main set and like just reworking them or something like that. So we're going to see a lot of that here. There is a bonus sheet called Breaking News. It is nothing but cards that commit crimes, and we'll talk about what committing a crime here is in just a second. But this is a lot of reprints. I think the Breaking News bonus sheet is actually exclusively reprints. And then there's something called the Big Score, which is the Aftermath style cards that are being repurposed for this set. And I think they all have like a giant emphasis on artifacts. And then there's also the list/special guests, which we are getting every single set now. And it does come to Arena, so these cards matter for us as well. So a lot of reprints coming in as well as a bunch of extra like new cards from the Big Score. I did want to mention, we're actually recording earlier than normal, so the entire set has not been released yet. We are on the weekend where they're presumably doing the big common dump at the end, whatever's left over. But there are some Breaking News and Big Score cards that we have not seen yet, and probably some big ones on those bonus sheets. So if there's anything that slips through our review today that is just like so tantamount that we have to talk about it, we will likely add it in, or we'll talk about it off air or something. We'll have an addendum to this in some way, shape, or form, but we're going to work with what we've seen so far.
Watch them reprint Mana Leak, and then in the like Aftermath like appendix or whatever, just print like better Mana Leak. it's like Mana Leak, but instead of adding X mana, it adds X mana +1.
Yeah, that would actually be just strictly better versions of all of the Breaking News cards.
Oh, that would be great. Like Path to Exile, except your opponent doesn't get a land.
You mean Swords to Plowshares?
It's just well, no, because Swords to Plowshares makes your opponent gain life. I'm talking about better Swords to Plowshares.
Oh yeah, when do we get better Swords of the Plowshares, Wizards? Isn't it time? I mean, we have 4-mana 6/5s with Trample. So this is all to say the set's a little bit messy as far as like everything that's included in it, but we'll be talking about everything that's been revealed so far for the purposes of Cube. And obviously we're going to keep this high level. We're going to be talking about just generally playable Cube cards, but we are emphasizing cards that we would consider in our own unrestricted Cube, or at least cards that are really important to have on the platform, whether we play them or not. We got mechanics. We can actually blow through a lot of these mechanics because most of them aren't relevant for us, but we should touch on what they all are. Starting off with the return of deserts. No big deal here for Cube purposes, unless you're doing something like really specific and thematic. Deserts aren't going to make your Cube. I don't think there are any standalone deserts that are really that good. But they are back. I mean, if they weren't in this set, I don't know that we would ever see deserts again. But do one of you guys want to talk to me about committing crimes? Anyone feeling particularly criminal this morning?
I mean, it's just targeting, right? And then anything that targets multiple things at the same time still counts as just having committed one crime.
Yeah, specifically targeting things your opponents own or control is like the easiest way to say it, right? So I think the wider swath of things is if you target a permanent they control, if you target them, if you target a spell they control on the stack, or if you target a card in their graveyard, that counts as committing a crime. And it's not something you have to track. I think Oko is the only card in the set that says like, how many crimes have you committed this turn? So you would have to track for that, but it's not something, it's not like a counter or something where like you have to remember how many crimes you committed on the previous turn or anything like that. And It does kind of restructure like removal spells and stuff like that. And there are actually quite a few cards today that we're going to talk about that are like, whenever you commit a crime, do blank, but you don't have to like go out of your way to support those because removal and interaction already does it.
And as far as tracking goes, a lot of these committing crimes cards have the once per turn rider on them anyway, so you really don't have to worry about that too much.
Yeah, it's a little goofy, right? Like you could target your opponent with a draw spell and it counts as committing a crime. Like from a flavor perspective, it doesn't make a lot of sense sometimes, but
right.
Well, yeah, you're forcing them at gunpoint to draw 3 cards when you target them with Ancestral.
Yeah, you're doing everything maliciously.
Draw your last 3 cards. The only other note I'll add to this is that obviously some colors are going to be better at committing crimes than others. Green is going to be the softest on its ability to do this.
Yeah, I assume red's probably the best at committing crimes. If not red, it'll be black.
Yeah, yeah, I'd say so. I do like that it works with counter spells though, because otherwise blue would not really be able to take advantage of this at all.
What do we have going on with plot here?
Yeah, so plot's pretty simple. A card with plot can be exiled from your hand for its plot cost. Usually it's going to be the same as the card's mana cost, but sometimes it's a little more or a little less. And then later you can cast it at sorcery speed on a future turn without paying the mana cost, so it's kind of got Foretell vibes. That being said, plotted cards are exiled face up, so it's not hidden information. Your opponent knows exactly what card you did. It'd be a little wonky if you could plot them face down because they don't all cost the same, which was why Foretell plot went face down, right? As it always costed 2, but plot ranges in terms of its mana cost. You can only plot cards at sorcery speed, so like a plotted counterspell is just a dead card, doesn't do anything for the rest of the game. And then the idea, I think, is that you're taking a turn where you're spending mana without impacting the board to give yourself a better turn in the future. A lot of these plot cards have some sort of when another creature enters play or when you do something else that really encourage you to want to double spell or triple spell in a turn so they can kind of set themselves up. Nothing too crazy here, but it does seem like there's a lot of cards that just randomly have plot, and it's like we're trying to think of use cases for it, but it is pure upside, right? A card having plot is just strictly better than not, even though it opens up room for misplaying the card.
Yeah, none of the plot cards we're going to talk about today, and we are going to talk about a few, none of the plot cards are... Like, plot is not an essential part of the reason we're talking about the card at all. So we'll discuss for some of the cards when you would actually even want to plot them in the first place. But this is just kind of like a flavor mechanic that works on cards, and it's pure upside for us. The next one is saddles and mounts, which we are going to talk about actually a surprising number of these today. Mount is a new creature type, and every mount has a saddle ability, and it works pretty much the same as crew. Saddle N means you can tap any number of creatures with total power N or greater, and the creature becomes saddled. until end of turn. You can only do that at sorcery speed, unlike crew. And the whole thing is like saddling a creature doesn't inherently do anything, but all of the mounts have abilities that matter if they've been saddled. So tap down another creature to saddle it and it gets some sort of bonus, usually on combat. So we'll talk about those on an individual case. It's again, a little bit of a goofy mechanic. It's just crew for creatures, but some of the individual cards produce interesting effects. Spree? Chris, you want to talk to us about Spree here?
Yeah, so spree spells have multiple additional costs that can each be paid up to once, each to add additional effects to the spell. There's a minimum of one mode that has to be chosen. The mana value of the card on the stack always remains the same, which is worth noting. Like, you can't Disdainful Stroke, a 1 mana spree spell that has 2 effects added on for 2 generic mana each for like a total of 5. It counts as a 1 mana spell on the stack, and then the effects resolve top to bottom. So there's a mix of cards like these. Some of them are like great flexible cards, and then some of them are, as like Justin Parnell used to say, several bad deals. But there are a couple that are interesting that we're going to talk about today. It's just modal spells. People enjoy modal spells, and this is kind of an interesting way to do it.
I will say with this one in particular, the fact that sometimes there are just a bunch of bad modes is actually mitigated somewhat by the fact that being able to choose multiple bad modes sometimes makes a good card. Like, one of the problem with bad modality is that if there's never a mode you're like really wanting to click, you feel bad about it. But if the totality of the card is like a 2 or a 3 for 1, even if it's not the best amount of individual effects, could get the card over the hump. I'm not sure if any of these will, but it is better to be able to do that than to have to pick one of these effects.
Sure. Yep.
Yeah, I think these are some of the most powerful cards in the set. And they look pretty bad if you think about them like charms, but the fact that you can like stack all the modes on top of each other makes them like so much better. But the two last things to talk about here, there's a batch-in mechanic called Outlaws. It is not a new creature type, but and if anything refers to Outlaws, it's referring to specifically assassins, mercenaries, pirates, rogues, and warlocks. That'll matter for like 1 or 2 cards for us, but not anything we're going to revolutionize our cube for. And then there is a recurring token that also comes up on some cards we'll talk about today. There's a 1/1 mercenary token that a lot of cards in this set make, and that token has a tap ability that gives a creature +1/+0 until end of turn, which can only be activated as a sorcery. So just mentioning that one up front. So if we just say mercenary token but don't explain what it does, they all have that ability. So those are the mechanics.
Yeah, I will also say I think these mercenary tokens, I don't know how many we're going to get, because as of right now, I think it's like 1 card that we're even considering. It probably won't make the cube that makes these. But if there ends up being some number of these that are playable, I actually think this sort of traveling ministrant style effect is generally just plays really well. So this could be a card type to look out for, because I think this is a lot, like a noticeable amount better than a regular 1/1 token.
Yeah, and there are other cards we could talk about today that were not, like the Salvala, the 4 mana 4/5 that makes a mercenary whenever you cast a creature. Like that would have been good enough to talk about, but it's just uninteresting. But
I was just going to preface that we're not talking about cards like that Salvala, because this set is so stacked that we've got just a million cards to talk about.
I mean, we're going to talk about a lot of cards. It is worth noting that this is a creature-heavy set. Like, for every section, we're going to mention, like, at most a spell or 2, but it's going to be majority creatures. It's just one of those, like, Lost Caverns of Ixalan-style sets in that regard, where the creatures are just really pushed, but the spells are a little bit lackluster in comparison. So, with all that being said, are we ready to get into some card-by-card reviews?
Yeah.
Giddy up!
Okay, who wants to talk about this first one? This is a special guest card. And a very big one for the client that probably doesn't make our cube, but at some point in the future, we might get the cards to actually support it.
Yeah, I'd actually like to talk about this one, because I think this was my number 1, like, cards I want on the client that we don't have yet. So we're finally getting Stoneforge Mystic, which, to those of you who have never played with this card, it is 1 and a white for a 1/2 core artificer. And when it ETBs, you may search your library for an equipment card, reveal it, and then you put it into your hand. And for 1 a white and tap it, you can put an equipment card from your hand onto the battlefield. I will just say that up front, this card is not going to be something that is relevant right now, I don't think. The only equipment we have that are worth going to tutor for at the moment are like Embercleave Bone Splitter. That being said, this is a card that we probably will readdress almost every set. Every time they give us a decent piece of equipment, we need to come back and consider, like, do we have the density to run this card? Because this is a pretty historically powerful card. And the card we're really waiting for, and one that I'm hoping is going to be spoiled in this vault set that we haven't seen yet, is Batterskull. That's the traditional partner, that or Cauldron Complete, though I think that card I would like to see less because I think it's more obnoxious. But Batterskull is the historical partner for this card. Just a very, very powerful card with Stoneforge Mystic. This is just a very exciting card to have on the client. There's a number of cubes that will probably be really excited about this. I think we're just a couple pieces of equipment short. We needed probably 3 pieces of equipment on the client that are like at Bone Splitter level or better to be able to, I think, justify this one.
We have a bunch of swords, right? Like, I'm not convinced that I ever want this to be good in our cube, to be honest with you. I mean, it'll have to be an ongoing conversation, but like, in order for Stoneforge Mystic to be like worth a card, it has to go get a powerful equipment and then either cheat on its mana cost, or even if it's not cheating on its mana cost, have that equipment be so busted that the fact that you're not cheating its mana cost doesn't matter.
If we knew we were getting Batterskull today, do you think that would push it over the line?
No, I mean, I straight up don't want that. Like, I don't want that 2-card combo.
Gotcha. Because I don't think Stoneforge doesn't necessarily need busted equipment to be playable. I think it just needs a density of equipment that you can always find one when you cast it, because then you're just doing the Spirited Companion thing, right? Like, you're playing a 2-mana 1x that draws you a card. In that case, I think if we were on things like Rabbit Battery and Lion Sash still, like enough reconfigure creatures, we could just justify this as like a little value 2-drop, even without playing like some busted equipment or something. But it's either going to be really busted with busted equipment, or it's probably just not going to get there without them, which is kind of a weird little paradox for the card to exist in.
Yeah, I guess I just assumed that at some point we're going to get more cards that are in the vein of like Barb Batterfist that are kind of close to being playable. Obviously, we need something that's a little bit better than that, but I don't think you need busted equipment. I just think you need, like you said, a density of targets that this just is going to consistently draw a card. I mean, I'm not opposed to like the Batterskull combo. I think there's more degenerate things to be doing in our cube anyways. Maybe that would be a big power bump in terms of availability, but also Batterskull would be a high priority pick in the first place, so assembling that combo isn't a guarantee either.
Yeah, I mean, this is also a known factor as far as cards go, so we can move on from it, but it is an exciting reprint for the client, and maybe at some point, like, another equipment sub-theme comes along that pushes it. But let's go ahead and talk about some of the new cards here. This next one's pretty big one. Chris, I want you to talk about this one, actually, because you kind of, like, spoke it into existence, but in the wrong color.
Yeah, I did. So, a while back, like, and this was before we got more like solid blue flash creatures on the client. So the like evolution of our disruptive aggro blue deck, which was really bad, it slowly, as we kind of realized what blue wanted to be doing, evolved into like an aggro control deck, which we talked about at length in a different episode. You want flash creatures, you want counter spells, you want removal, so you can decide whether to interact or commit to the board, depending on what your opponent's doing on their turn. And I said that I wanted a blue 3-drop creature with flash that was either like a 2/1 that force spiked or like a 1/1 that make disappeared, and that I'd be happy with that even with the anemic stat line. This card, Aven Interrupter, not only is it in that vein, but it's just another example of like their general attitude towards printing blue cards now. It's like, you know what would be cool is if we made green draw as many cards as blue, and we started giving white really effective counter spell stack interaction tempo plays. Blue doesn't get to do anything new though. So Aven Interrupter is 1 white for a 2/2 flash flying, which is a fine stat line, Windrake with flash. And it enters the battlefield, exile target's spell, it becomes plotted. Notably, this, just like Reprieve, does not counter the spell. So if Carnage Tyrant is on the stack, this takes it off the stack. So it becomes plotted. That means that they're going to be able to cast it at sorcery speed at a later turn. But this also says spells your opponents cast from graveyards or from exile cost 2 more to cast. So the card that you exiled into the plot zone or whatever now costs 2. So the total cost of the card, once they eventually resolve it, is 2 more than it was originally going to be. Furthermore, there are a lot of cards in red that impulse draw cards now, and this makes those significantly more expensive to cast. And in red decks, generally speaking, if you're impulse drawing, you know, you need to be able to cast those spells like at their cheap cost, or you're not really drawing them. This also has graveyard spell taxing effects, which I'm sure is going to have an impact on constructed somewhere. And also, notably, Teld, I think you mentioned this a while back. Like, if you counter a counter spell with this, you just countered the counter spell. Because there's nothing to do with a sorcery speed counter spell. So if you're on 5 mana and you're like resolving your Luminarch Aspirant and your opponent goes to counter it, you just flash an Aven Interrupter and you just got a 2/2 flash flying body that has static like nerfs on certain things your opponents could be doing, and also just countered the counter spell. Tim, you also mentioned flashback and adventures, stuff like that. Adventures specifically.
Yeah. So I mean, the point there being that people cast spells from graveyards in exile way more than you like actively think they do. Like, it just happens a lot. And case in point, adventures are cards that get cast from exile. That's just an example of like an exile based mechanic that this just coincidentally hoses on top of like just doing what it does as a 1-for-1 against your opponent's spells.
Doesn't this impact Discover and Cascade and things like that too?
Yeah. So your opponent would have to pay 2 extra to cast whatever they cascade into, which is likely not happening. So for our purposes, like if someone casts Bloodbraid Elf and you respond to the cascade trigger by casting this, you can exile the Bloodbraid off the stack and plot it, and then whatever they cascade into, they presumably can't cast unless they have 2 open mana as well.
Yeah. So anyway, just to move on, this is just on its face a very good flash speed, disruptive tempo play that I'm sure in a lot of cubes people are going to find all these like weird edges on it where it like incidentally messes up like other plans that your opponent has. It's just all upside. It's a good card.
Chris, I'm also going to have you talk about the next one because I know Teld is dying to talk about the one after it. Plus, I think you are more interested in this card than I had given it credit for.
Yeah, so this is, let me preface this by saying this is, like, not going to be for your Power Max cube, right? Like, this is Fortune, Loyal Steed. It's 2 and a white for a legendary creature beast mount. This is the first mount we're going to be talking about. It is a 2/4. When it ETBs, scry 2. Whenever it attacks while saddled, at end of combat, exile it, and up to 1 creature that saddled it this turn, then return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control. So that line of text is on there so you can't like saddle with all your ETB creatures and just blink your entire board. Notably, it has saddle of 1. So I think that this is great for blink value decks if that's something that you're really pushing, or you have like a 540 card cube that has like space for kind of build around these semi-niche cards like this. And I think it's great for those decks for a couple of reasons. First of all, when it ETBs, it scries 2, so it has its own ETB. It's also a 2/4, which your blink decks generally don't want to be winning by attacking with a bunch of stats. You know, they prefer like either creatures that have ETB value or have toughness enough to kind of keep you from getting dead while you're sort of accruing this blink value. Also, like being a 2/4 means like in the early stages of the game, it's going to be you're not going to be able to like block this with a single creature and just eat it in a lot of decks. And finally, the saddle cost is only 1. So as we all know, like the very best vehicles all tend to have very low crew costs, right? It's for this reason that I think that Subterranean Schooner is like exceptional in our blink decks, because blink decks tend to play a bunch of dinky creatures like Mana Wars and things like that that have some impact on the board. You're not really going to be able to attack with them in a lot of situations, especially in the current state of Magic where so many creatures are just like the vanilla test is just not like a thing anymore. So, I mean, you can crew this, quote-unquote, with, like, your Spirited Companion or whatever. Like, literally any creature that has an ETB effect that doesn't have 0 power, and I think those are kind of rare, can saddle this. Your Watcher for Tomorrow can saddle this. Your Blade Splicer can saddle this. So I think all of the knobs and numbers on this card are just tuned for it to be really effective in a blink value style deck if you're pushing that sort of thing in your cube. I think this is a really cool print for that style of deck.
You know, Chris, you're kind of talking me up on this card. I think this card is a lot more interesting than I also gave it credit for. I hadn't considered that you scry 2 on ETB, and then like when you blink it, it blinks both things, so you immediately get another scry 2, even if the creature you saddled it with doesn't have its own ETB trigger, which is kind of nice.
Totally. And if you're blinking something like a Spirited Companion that draws a card, like obviously you stack the triggers in such a way that you scry 2 and draw.
Well, then it's actually Palantir.
Yeah. So, like I said, in like a 360 card, power maxed, non-hyper thematic cube, There's probably no space for this. There's like a million excellent white 3-drops. We just talked about one. But if you're pushing the style of deck, I think that this is like a perfect design.
Yeah, this is the kind of card that I think would be fun to try in the 450 just to see how it performs.
Totally. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could be into that.
I do like that a mount can crew a vehicle, and then the vehicle can then saddle the mount. So if you want to go ahead and put the mental image of what that would look like in your head.
Oh my god, that's amazing.
Teld is obviously going to be more excited about cards like this next one than anybody else, so it's just fair that Teld talks about it.
Yeah, so the next card is Nurturing Pixie. It is a single white mana for a 1/1 with flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you can return up to one target non-fairy, non-land permanent you control to its owner's hand. If a permanent was returned this way, you put a +1/+1 counter on Nurturing Pixie. Boys, we got Core Sky Fisher at 1 mana. We have done it. I feel like Core Sky Fisher is a card that everybody knows is one of my absolute favorite Magic cards. It might be my favorite Magic card. I adore that effect. I think it's super fun. And I think Core Sky Fisher is just short of being good enough for the unrestricted cube, simply because having to set it up a little bit does have a cost. I sort of feel like when you get this effect to 1 mana and we're still talking about potentially getting 2 power worth of flying, this is just gotta be the rate that this card needs to cost to play in like a really powerful environment like ours, I think. If this is not good enough, this effect would not be good enough at this power level. I think that this card being 1 mana though is just there's so much you can do in our white section with this for a single mana. It's going to set up a lot of really powerful plays, especially with cards like Clarion Spirit or things like that.
Yeah, it lets you double spell easily, lets you rebuy ETBs. Like, you could even run it out on turn 1 because you can't pick up a land, so it doesn't have that Core Sky Fisher problem where, like, you can't just run it out on curve if you have nothing else to pick up without Stone Raining yourself. And it does leave behind a 2/2 flyer. So this is like, I mean, I'm surprised to see this effect at 1 because we get it at 3 a lot more often than we do at 2 these days. So, Chris, do you think this gets there at 1 mana?
I think it's an interesting effect. I think that it has like a nice range of applications, and I think we're going to play it. If I was just playing a super streamlined white aggro deck that wasn't like littered with cheap ETB creatures, I think I'd rather just have like a 1 mana 2/2. But I think that this does enough interesting stuff. I think it has applications outside of raw aggro, and I think if you have like a couple of targets that are worth picking up, then this is probably playable in your aggro deck. In situations where it's flying man, it obviously sucks. And if you like end up having to pick up like a 2-drop creature without an ETB to get the 2/2 flyer, at that point I think it also sucks. But white has a lot of like cool ETBs kind of lying around. Like, you know, you'll play Blade Splicer in your white aggro deck, right? You'll play, and is this non-land permanent? Yeah, this resets planeswalkers. This does enough cool shit that like we're gonna play it.
Yeah, Teld's doing everything in his power to act like he's not going to try to pick up Kogla and Yadaro with this.
Don't tell the people my secrets.
But yeah, we can move on from that one. I know Teld's very excited about it and shooing for Peasant, obviously.
I will say this before we move on. I fully expect to play a game against a Nurturing Pixie where someone just does something like parity breaking with it. Like, this is a card that I'm sure I'm going to see it do something impressive that, like, a different white 1-drop, like, could not possibly have done. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I expect it to be solid. I think that you should look at your deck construction before you decide that this is just, like, a slam 1-drop.
Turn 1 Mishra's Bauble, 2/2 flyer. Let's go.
Hell yeah, baby.
Yeah, I think the TLDR for this would be either have a number of ETB effects or be playing a mountain of 1 and 0 cost permanents.
Yep, exactly. Next one is a known factor, but it is on one of the bonus sheets. Path to Exile is coming to the client for the first time. Maybe modern players don't know what Path to Exile is because it hasn't been relevant in a long time, but single white mana for an instant exile target creature. Its controller searches the library for a basic land, puts it on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. And I've been a known like poo-pooer of cards like this, like Assassin's Trophy. Besaju's so free that it gets a pass. These cheap removal spells that replace whatever you removed with a land, I do not like them, but I do think Path to Exile is still above rate compared to some of the clunkier white removal that we still play, like Lay Down Arms, and I guess a closer comparison would be something like Declaration in Stone, Fateful Absence, these cards that like remove a threat very efficiently, but at the cost of giving your opponent something back. Giving your opponent a land from their library for free is one of the biggest drawbacks that you can have, especially with how, like, cheap the good cards are now. Like, you're not you just can't fire off. The caveat here is obviously you can't fire off Path to Exile on, like, your opponent's 1 or 2 drop. You have to save it for mid-late game.
Yeah, no, you cannot do that.
In the early game, if you use something like Path to Exile on a cheap card, you are like 2-for-1ing yourself. You are giving your opponent a valuable, relevant resource, possibly the most relevant resource in a game of Magic in the first, like, 5 turns.
Yeah, if you're not making a significant tempo play with this card, then you're getting a really, really bad deal.
You can also, I mean, like, 1 out of every 10 games you will path your own, like, token or something like that to ramp. Like, it is a thing that comes up every now and then. Especially if your opponent's going to, like, kill your own creature and, like, your path to, like, against a control deck or something, and your Path to Exile would be better served as a land on the battlefield. Like, that's a play you can make.
You know, Chris, this is actually a spot where I wanted, you have a mark about original card art on here, and I do want to take just a brief moment to talk about how much this annoys me, because I think this is my favorite card art of Path to Exile I've seen available. I love it. I think it is thematic and beautiful. I love the color palette. I think these breaking news card arts so far that I've seen have been absolutely incredible. And they are completely ruined by the way the card frame has this stupid prosperity across the top, like it's a newspaper, instead of just looking like it's designed to be a newspaper. Like, if it just had kind of a newspapery sort of card frame where it was like, you know, you could kind of tell that, I would love it. I would think it was amazing. But that big headliner of prosperity across the top does 2 things. One, it looks goofy and not like a Magic card. It makes me think it's a different card name. And then also, it compresses this absolutely gorgeous art so that I get to see less of this wonderful art on that card.
Yeah, I agree with you. They could have done something like, you see the card type instant kind of has, like, Wild Westy newspaper headline font. They could have just cut the, like, prosperity post header and then made the actual rules text on the cards look more like old-timey newspaper print. And that would have achieved, like, exactly the same effect without, as you mentioned, compressing the art. Because I agree with you. Like, I'm, like, a weirdo who does not play any alternate arts, hates foils, just, like, wants things to be incredibly, like, uniform and standard. I don't know why that is. That's just a personality trait that I have. So I don't like alt art cards. But as far as alt arts are concerned, I agree with you. Like, this is incredibly thematic. This looks like exactly what the card is, but it's like this tiny little sliver of art because they cut like 10% of the frame off.
They do have the opportunity to do the funniest thing in the world here and have the card Prosperity as a bonus sheet card and then just have, like, Prosperity on there twice. But I agree. I'm not a graphic designer, but if you just cut that top little portion off that said Prosperity, these cards would look so much better. Last white card here. I added this one. I don't know what you guys think of it, but I wanted to talk about it because I was kind of, like, parsing out how it played. But the last white card is Getaway Glamour. It is a spree card, so again, the cost in the upper right corner is white, but you can't cast it for white because these spree cards don't have an inherent effect. So you have to choose at least one of the other modes and tack on that mana cost. So the first mode is +1 colorless mana, or 1 generic mana, and it says exile target non-token creature, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. And then for +2 generic mana, you can destroy target creature if no other creature has greater power. So it can't be tied for greatest power, it just straight up kills whatever the greatest power creature on board is. But if there's something tied for greatest, it can't do that. So just to parse this out, and the reason this was interesting to me is that there's a ton of modality here beyond what is just written on the card. So you can pay 2 mana to blink a creature, essentially. It could be yours or it could be your opponent's. You could pay 3 mana to destroy the highest power creature on board, or you could pay 4 mana to blink a creature and destroy the highest power creature. And if there's a tie, you can blink out whatever's tied with the highest power to then leave behind a creature that is the highest power and kill that. It also has, like, this hidden mode where you can just remove 2 of your opponent's blockers for a turn. You could always just pay 2 mana and get an opponent's creature out of the way for a turn. It'll come back into play at the end of the turn, but if you're, like, an aggressive white deck, you can just say, okay, 2 mana, get this blocker out of the way, and attack you, try to kill you. Obviously, you could pay 4 mana as well. So I don't know what you guys are thinking of. I don't think this is like straight up replacement for Ephemerate because that card's so broken and specialized at what it's doing. And this is obviously 2 mana to blink a thing. But I think there's a lot of flexibility in this card. Like I could see a blink deck obviously wanting this and using it as removal on top of an enabler. And then I could see this in potentially a white aggressive deck as a way to go like kill your 5/5, get another blocker out of the way, and just flunge for the turn. And even in those decks, you could blink one of your own creatures as well. So I don't know if this speaks to you guys the same way it spoke to me, but I thought the card had a lot of flexibility to it.
Yeah, this card's sweet.
My thoughts, I think, can be summarized as this seems like a good card for peasant environments.
I think this card is unrestricted playable.
Same.
Like if you're in a white deck and you're against a deck that's playing big creatures, like you're going to get full value off of this card, aren't you?
I don't agree with that. 2 mana to blink a thing is not a good rate. I mean, it's a fine protection spell, but, like, it's not a good rate. And there are going to be so many situations where you're, like, playing against a control deck that controls no creatures. There are going to be aggro mirrors where the board is just, like, littered with, like, 2 and 3 power creatures, and there's no target for the removal, in which case this card is, like, a really bad deal. The reason that I say that I can definitely see it for peasant environments is, like, a lot of what makes an uncommon creature powerful is whether or not it has like a solid value ETB, but they're also just like peasant creatures that aren't like giant stat sticks plus a bunch of value. They're, you know, peasant creatures that are just kind of like keyword big, and that's what makes them good. So I mean, like I said, I see this as like a really solid peasant value card for a lot of different peasant environments, but like what in God's name would we cut from our 360 card power max cube to fit this in?
I'm not entirely sure yet, but I do think we need to have that discussion. I will say this also adds, this is kind of a thing of like, you know, the 4 mana shell game that white plays where you, is it Restoration Angel, or is it the Wandering Emperor, or is it Settle the Wreckage, or is it Getaway Glamour? Just add another shell to that game.
I agree that the blink mode's obviously not efficient when you already have Ephemerate in your cube, right? So like you can't just cut Ephemerate for this and be like, this is a blink support with extra thing. And like the removal mode is also more expensive than, yeah, it's not great on its own, but you do get to, well, I don't think it's bad. Like you're paying 3 mana to usually kill 4 mana creature. Like your opponent goes Ulvenwald Oddity. Like you pay 3 mana, that's obviously worse than Fateful Absence, but
I think
actually it's not even necessarily worse than Fateful Absence.
I feel like you're picturing this against a green deck though, and Fateful Absence hits Planeswalkers. Get Lost hits creatures, Planeswalkers.
I don't think this card is better than those cards, but it has additional modality. I also don't think that, like, I think a blink spell is very good against a control deck. Like, they usually trade 1-for-1 on that. Well, more than 1-for-1.
I mean, when are you getting full value off of this? Like, your opponent has a big green creature and you have a Blade Splicer on board? Like,
sure.
Is that a thing that just doesn't happen? Like,
no, it happens. It happens, but like there are gonna be so many matchups where you draw this card and it just doesn't.
Right, which is why like we probably wouldn't play it, but I don't.
There's matchups where you draw Ephemerate and it doesn't do anything either. Like,
I think it's hard for the card to be a straight up blank, but you won't get full value off of it. Like I agree with that. You won't get full value off of this like every game, but it's designed in a way that it's very hard for it to be a blank.
Teld, I know you're not comparing this card to Ephemerate. Like I know you're not doing that right now.
I mean, not directly. No, I think they're not directly. No, I think Ephemerate is extremely efficient. It's obviously busted. It's really good against single target removal. I will say, because this card does until end of turn, this card is substantially better against wrath effects than any of the other blink effects for a white aggro deck, right? Because this lets you actually keep a creature in play.
Yeah, I mean, I think bottom line here is like it's overcosted on both modes, and the flexibility might not, or the full value mode might not come up in enough matchups that like it's actually worth cutting a card that's consistently very good at what it does for it. But I think saying like you're not going to get value out of this card in certain matchups is incorrect. Like I think you will use one of these modes in any given matchup. You're just not going to get full value. But if you're not getting full value most of the time, like then it's pretty clunky, even if it's modal.
I just think it's too cute, and like maybe you guys can wear me down, but like at this point, I'm prepared to like fight you tooth and nail to not play this card.
I will settle for too cute and say we should move on from this one.
Yeah, I think Chris is falling prey to the like spree being modal, but also modal plus is going to play much, much better than it looks. But I'm willing to believe that this card, maybe it's not good enough for the unrestricted cube just off of efficiency's sake. But I think it's a very cool card nonetheless.
We can settle on cool, but possibly too cute for what the slot would be dedicated.
In Peasant, can you imagine like casting this for full value on your like Ravenous Chupacabra?
the fact that you say that, but those are just cards that exist in the unrestricted cube is like weird to me, but I get
no. Yeah, exactly. But like, I mean, like I said, Peasant tends to be like more creature littered and like a bunch of other shit. But like, there are gonna be times you cast this for full value in a Peasant environment, and it's just literally gonna end the game.
I'm looking forward to going Micromancer 2 to this up. Micromancer full cast, kill your biggest creature, blink my Micromancer, go get another card, like.
Yeah, it's insane with Micromancer. So with that, we're going to go ahead and move into blue. Okay, Chris, you poo-pooed the white card here. That's fair enough. Why don't you go ahead and take a card that we know for a fact is going to make the cube and is going to be probably a big player moving forward.
So this is another card that I straight up willed into existence.
Yes.
This card is Stoic Sphinx. It's 2 blue for a 5/3 flash flyer. And it has hexproof as long as you haven't cast a spell this turn. So I posted this to Reddit, and a variety of people said they were really excited about it. Someone else said that they don't run a blue beatdown deck, so they're not interested in it. And then someone else said that there are better control finishers. So this has the magic combination of flash and flying that I think, at least in our cube design or fair cube, however you want to characterize it, but I think this probably like applies pretty broadly at this point in Magic's history, because you just like, there's no safe time to go shields down anymore. Once upon a time in Control, it was like pick your spot and resolve your thing, and then like they're probably at this point like kind of out of resources or whatever. But we're at a point in Magic's history where, like, no one is ever out of resources and, like, everything snowballs. So, like, going shields down is, like, kind of unacceptable.
I was going to say the one exception there being, as we pointed out, there are some cards that are kind of table flippers, like Chrome Host Seed Shark and Svalin, that are
totally
cheap and they're worth going shields down for because the return on investment you tend to get there is enough. But when you're talking about, like, those, like, 5 mana cards, yeah, that's where you're really starting to get into that range of, like, you just can't tap out for these.
No, it's like, okay, here's my like 5 mana finisher, and then the green player just goes like, here's my green thing that's resistant to removal and drew a card and dies into something, and you're just like, fuck, okay. So 5 power flying in the air is a very fast clock. Even assuming that you've done no damage, you're clocking them in 4 turns, right? This has hexproof as long as you haven't cast a spell this turn. So if you're playing like a draw go style, it's basically resistant to any kind of sorcery speed removal that's not a wrath. And basically the windows that they're going to have to remove this with sorcery speed removal is if they play something on their turn that you effectively like have to counter, and then they drop a sorcery speed removal spell on this, or if they have an instant speed removal spell in their hand, if you go end step cantrip or, you know, end step whatever, they have an opportunity to pop this, right? So there are some windows where you can kill this, but I think the thing about this card is because it's a 5 power flyer and it clocks so fast, having this card on board actually changes the dynamic of what you have to counter. Mm-hmm. You know, like there are just things that your opponent's going to be able to resolve while you have counter spells in your hand that are like good, but are not going to outrace this, so you don't have to go shields down on this. Like, you get to be really, I think you get to be really particular about what you have to counter at this point, because they're not the person asking the questions now. You are, right? As far as there being better control finishers, actually, Teld, I'm going to let you speak to this because you've talked a lot about how in the increasing speed of the game, control finishers need to be faster than they used to be.
Yeah, I mean, the advantage here being able to hold up shields up is obviously incredible. But like when we actually look at the cards that are winning in our unrestricted cube, the kind of finishers of choice for control decks have mostly been Chrome Host Sea Shark, right? Svalin, these sort of things that are more like mid-rangey finishers. But the expensive ones, we're seeing a lot less Teferi Temporal Pilgrim. That card is good, but it doesn't see as much play in like pure control decks. We see a lot more like Horned Lockwill, Torrential Gearhulk, Sublime Epiphany type cards, these flash big creatures.
Flash. Yep.
The kind of notable exception to that is something like Quintorius Loremaster. And the reason is that, like, first of all, you get a lot of stats for the value. And then also, if you untap with it, you probably just table flip the game and you can't lose. And like, the upside of untapping with that card is so high. And also, you're playing a control deck that can, usually the Quintorius decks are like the dedicated control decks that can, like, play this on turn 7, turn 8 when they can back it up with counter magic. But this is just, it's relatively cheap. Like, coming down with 4 mana up, there's a million different cards you could have that it could be that they don't know this is coming. And I think against a lot of decks, if they don't get started fast, like you said, you're just not gonna be able to race this. You're not gonna have to care anymore what your opponent's playing. Like, a couple of dorky 2/1s probably doesn't outrace this. And it kind of creates this interesting thing too, where your opponent needs to commit to the board to beat it, right? But the cards that are going to race this are a little more expensive. And so if your opponent has 4 mana and spends 4 mana playing like an Ulvenwald Oddity trying to race this, which by itself won't, but you get my point. If they play that, well, now you counter it because they're tapped out. And so, like, I think this is just going to lead to the sort of gameplay patterns that lets blue leverage its counter magic aggressively that it didn't really have before, just because the clock on this is so fast. 5 power is incredible. They could have printed this at 4 power and I would still be excited about it, but 4 to 5 is a major difference, right?
It's a whole turn.
Yeah. And once upon a time, they probably would have printed this with like a 2/4 stat line or something.
Yeah.
In blue. Like you said, it's the 4-turn clock. Just kind of like readdressing this particular point, because the game has gotten so much faster. The faster you can flip the game as the controlled player, the better off you're going to be, right? Like, flipping the game on turn 4 is better than flipping the game on turn 6. And not only that, but like, another interesting edge that I think this card has is if you're holding up 4 mana, Teld, like you mentioned, you know, you could be holding up any number of things. What a lot of players will do in that situation is they'll assume that you have counter magic. So they'll stuff like a suboptimal play onto the stack because, like, they don't want to dump their Essica's Chariot into your like obvious counter spell, right?
Right.
So maybe they play like a 3-drop that's not as impactful, which actually increases the range of windows that you have to resolve this, because a lot of players are not going to jam you absolutely must counter this spell into counterspell if they have some alternative weaker play that they're going to try to bait your counter magic out with. And at that point, if they play something like a little bit less aggressive and snowbally because it's like either cheaper or it's like a value play or whatever, that actually provides you a window in which to resolve this card, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I also think there's this I don't know how often will come up, but there's going to be some percentage of the time where your opponent taps out, plays a haste creature, you flash this in and like eat one of their attackers. They're like 2/2 or something, and then like untap and just protect it. I think this card also makes a card that I'm not particularly fond of that I do acknowledge as a good card, so like Fading Hope. That card I think plays much better with this, just because it can protect it if you happen to go shields down. It can like undo your opponent's tempo when if they were ahead on board when you cast it, giving you that kind of window to. Like you slam that, right? Your opponent taps out, you slam this at the end of turn, you untap Fading Hope, their best thing, and now you go shields up back on their turn.
Do you see a world where this card's actually problematic in our cube?
Could be.
I could. So like, on top of all the like the control applications that we just mentioned, this is obviously like a ridiculous top end threat for like aggro control. It's kind of funny that they're like slapping ward on everything randomly, but instead of giving this like ward 4 or something, they gave it straight up hexproof. I think even with like Ward 3, as long as you haven't cast a spell this turn, I'd still be excited about this card, because at that point you can't even get a tempo advantage out of like swordsing it or whatever. I could see the hexproof nature of it just pissing enough people off. Like, okay, this got resolved by a skilled blue player who like picked their spots on when to expose it perfectly, and I just never had a chance. If it really starts to like lead to a bunch of like terrible feel bads, then I could see it being a problem. But as we've probably mentioned several times on the show, I'm a lot more willing to test something that has the potential for terrible feel bads in blue than I am in other colors.
You know what I just realized? Yeah. This is just blue Vinemare.
that flies and has more power and flash.
This is an early front runner for the Adult Gold Dragon Award for the year, by the way. And I will also say, if we could just like get through one blue section of any cube review without Teld bringing up Quintorius Loremaster as the best blue card in the cube, like if we could just do that one time. So let's go ahead and move on from there. We've got 2 spells to talk about in blue. One of them's a pretty quick one, but the new one here for us is 3 Steps Ahead. This is a single blue mana for a spree instant at rare, and the modes are +1 in a blue, counter target spell, +3 generic mana, create a token that's a copy of target artifact or creature you control, or +2 generic mana, draw 2 cards, then discard a card. And I just want to get this out of the way that like a lot of people immediately compare this to Sublime Epiphany, because if you spend a bunch of mana, you get similar kind of modes. I don't like that comparison because you're not actually going to do that very often. And Sublime Epiphany is always a 6 mana card. This is a modal card that sometimes costs 3 mana. You can't Gear Hulk it, which is a big thing for Sublime Epiphany. Well, you can, but not in the same way. So, like, I don't think the Sublime Epiphany comparison makes a lot of sense. What I do think is a good comparison is just a normal 3 mana counter spell, where this gives you additional functionality by adding on additional modes. And when I first read this card, the first thing that came to mind for me was You Find the Villain's Lair, which is the one blue cancel variant that you can alternatively like draw to, discard to. But this is where the spree thing really adds to it. Instead of being modal, like, yes, you have to pick one of these modes. Like, in the late game, you do get to do additional stuff with it. So if this card just said pick a mode and that was it, I think it'd be quite bad. Because when you actually put it on the stack, any of the given modes that you're casting just aren't that great. But the fact that you can tack on additional modes as the game goes on makes this quite good. So a lot of times this is going to be 1 blue counter spell cancel as a baseline, but on 5 mana 1 blue counter spell draw 2 discard a card, that's actually not too bad if you just have the extra mana lying around to do it. You know, it gives you a way to spend all of your mana in a control deck. It gives you a lot of functionality, and the baseline, I would say cancel as a baseline is not good enough for a card, but this does additional stuff on top of it instead of additional stuff in place of it, and I think that's a big selling point for this counterspell.
Yeah, I think the copy mode here is also much better than it would have been a year ago. We have some legitimately threatening blue creatures that are scary to copy. You've got stuff like Tishana's Tidebinder and the various 2-power, Hateberry kind of effects. You've got Chromos Siege Shark, yeah. On top of like the card that we just talked about, the Sphinx, right? Can you imagine like your opponent tries to race you and they tap out and play a bunch of stuff and you're just like, well, if you thought one 5/3 with Hexproof was annoying, how about a second?
Yeah. I think this card's just very good. I wasn't high on it until talking with the community about it, and now I think it's probably in the running for like one of our better counter spells. And we're still on cards like Confound and Conundrum and stuff like that, and this just, or Confound and Riddle, whatever it's called. This is just, in my opinion, so much better than a card like that because it has added functionality as the game continues.
Yeah, I think this card pretty directly compares to that, right? You've got 3 mana counter a card, 3 mana or card selection, except you got all these extra effects as you go in the game.
This is one of the ways that I've wanted to see them start pushing counter magic again, is to add more modality to counter spells. If they're not going to print hyper efficient counter spells with regularity anymore, then I'm okay with them printing somewhat inefficient counter spells that offer me some optionality. And one other way to think about it is like if you ignore the copy effect, like because blue, has, at least in our cube, and I think in many cubes, has not only the least targets, but a lot of the best blue creatures tend to be like legendary. So like let's just ignore like the token making text. I mean, you could see this as cancel with like super cycling. And in some cases, if you're holding like extra lands in your hand, like this is effectively just like instant speed divination, right? If you just have like a dead card in your hand, like if you're holding like a Stern Scolding and you're just past the point in the game that the Stern Scolding matters, in which case this is kind of like cancel with an instant speed divination tacked onto it. So yeah, I mean, I agree with you guys. Like, I want to see these effects like pushed even like a little harder, but I'm looking at the numbers on this and like I'm not really sure how they could have done that without sort of like breaking it. So
I will say I've been on the record as saying I don't think Wraths are particularly good in control decks anymore. And one of the downstream things of that is that when I draft control decks, I tend to be looking to try to put as many cheap like 1 and 2 mana effects that trade 1 for 1 in as possible. And one of the costs of that is that very frequently you're just trading resources, spinning your wheels with your opponent, and you need to have ways to get ahead. So one of the ways you use is like dismiss, right? Or, the card that shall not be named that lets you, generate card advantage over the course of the game. But this is the kind of card I want to see, right? So this is another one of those dismiss kind of effects where once we've gotten to the mid to late game and we've traded resources with all my 1 and 2 mana cards, I now have a card that lets me pull ahead. You counter something, that's the 1-for-1 trade, right? But then you draw 2, discard 1. Like, even if you're not at a point where you're discarding lands and it's just free value, you're still up a card because you've already traded 1-for-1 with your card. So the draw 2, discard 1 is just putting you up a card. But if you do discard a land because you had an extra one, now you're looking at like counterspell plus divination, and now we're looking at some serious gasoline in terms of like making sure we can keep trading with our opponent.
Totally. If you have access to like every counterspell ever printed, you're probably not going to be interested in this, just because, like, I mean, obviously I don't think that this card is better than Mana Leak, but at least for the arena card pool, I think that this is a relatively big deal.
Yeah, and speaking of pushed counterspells, we just wanted to give a quick shout out to Mana Drain, which, surprise, surprise, is in the bonus sheet. Can you imagine getting Mana Drained in Retail Limited? Like, what?
Oh, it's gonna suck.
Get out of here.
Like, the first time that happens, you get Mana Drained, your opponent untaps and plays Paul Bunyan or whatever, just on like turn 4.
I don't believe Blue. In fact, this is a different conversation, but Blue's actually been doing fairly well. But I don't think Blue has ever been in such dire straits that we would play Mana Drain.
No, absolutely not.
This is immediate timeless territory, but it is nice actually that timeless. Like we always talk about how the shift from unrestricted to timeless doesn't really give Blue anything because we're already playing the best Blue cards that are available on the platform. But now there's actually like a distinct Blue card that is like a powerhouse card for timeless cubes specifically. But for us, we don't need this. Yeah. we don't need this card.
Do you guys know what set this was originally printed in? Was this printed
Legends.
Before? Okay, so it was printed after Counterspell.
Yes, Counterspell was alpha, wasn't it?
Yeah. So I think it's really amazing that this was like printed in a set with like a 5-mana Naya 4/2, and then they just printed Mana Drain.
The one downside of this card when it was first printed, though, is there was a mechanic called Mana Burn, right? Yeah.
But there was just like no blue cards that you could like Mana Drain something and then cast like your black, red, green legend like 6/4 for 7 or whatever. Like. But yeah, we don't want to spend a lot of time on the reprints here. We are going to move into black, which has a lot of creatures, again, to talk about. I think I'm like a notch below most people on this first card, so if one of you guys wants to talk about eensy teensy Mr. Bones here.
All right, so this is Tiny Bones the Pickpocket. It is a single black for a 1/1 Death Toucher, legendary skeleton, another rogue. And whenever Tiny Bones the Pickpocket deals combat damage to a player, you may cast target non-land permanent from that player's graveyard, and mana of any type can be spent to cast that spell. This is a good card. Like, a 1/1 Death Toucher is just a fine rate. You have on here that Death Touchers always get their man. When you want to block with them, Death Touchers, they will always trade with the creature you're blocking with unless it has first
They
trade.
either get a removal spell or they get a creature.
Yeah. This is probably worse against control. This is they don't often have too many non-land permanents. On the other hand, they also have fewer blockers. So if you've killed one of their creatures, you've thought seized one of their creatures or planeswalkers, you can get one of them out of the graveyard more easily because this guy is going to threaten that, and they're going to have to use a removal spell on a 1-mana card, probably trade down. So, like, I think there's a lot of play to this card. I think the sort of Jundi decks probably are interested in this. They play a lot of removal. They play a lot of card advantage. This like stalls out the early game, and then if you're able to get a good advantage on your opponent where you kill their only blocker or something and get a hit in, you probably are able to generate a lot of advantage. Also, look how adorable he is. He's running across the piano. He's a little skeleton guy with a little cowboy hat and a little bag, and he's running across the piano. It's very, very, very classic, like goofy Western comedy. I like the art on this card a lot.
When I saw the art originally, like, I didn't get as close to it, and I thought he had, like, a big sheriff handlebar mustache made out of, like, eldritch smoke, and I was, like, really into that. But this is still cool. I think this card is good. I actually don't mind seeing a black 1-drop that doesn't just, like, give control an absolute fisting. Because, like, most of the recursive black 1-drops just do. It's like, okay, there's 2 power on the board, and there will always be 2 power on the board. My primary concern with this card is that sometimes it's not going to do much, and sometimes it's going to be like, okay, dude, like, I think it's really cool
Yeah.
that you cast my questing beast out of my graveyard or whatever, but, like, okay, I guess I'll just die now. So we'll have to see if this is, like, ends up being, like, a polar card where it's either, like, a 1/1 death touch or it, like, wrecks the game. But I do think it's really interesting. Generally speaking, I do not like cards that let you play with your opponent's cards. I'm just not a big fan of that mechanic, like, at all. But I mean, this is absolutely worth testing, right? Just to see what it does.
Yeah, I like Typhoid Rats. It's a cool little card.
I mean, legitimately, I am interested. I love when you can make a cheap, like, 1-mana Death Touch creature into a playable card. I'm a fan of those cards just because of the defensive value they provide to the decks I like to play.
Totally. I just think this is a case in point, like a best case mentality card that a lot of people, when they saw it, they're like, oh, my opponent's going to play Land War Elves, I'm going to Fatal Push it and cast it out of their graveyard on turn 2. I was like, come on. Like, can you, like, yes, that can happen. It might happen, but, like, that's not the use case for this card. Like, it's not going to do that every time. But I do like that it has the kind of, like, Bomat Courier vibes. You know, like, I'm going to get value if you don't block this, but it has Death Touch, so you have to block it, whereas Bomat Courier just gets, like, brick walled. So
yeah, I think this is still more like a Jund card than a aggro card. I mean, I could see it being good in aggressive decks, but the sort of rock style removal heavy decks I think are going to get more value out of this card because like we talk a lot about the whole Buffalo, right? Like, if you aren't interested in Death Touch as a defensive mechanic, it's a lot worse because, you know, your opponent just puts like a token in front of it and it trades.
That's Lords of Limited. They talk about the whole Buffalo. We've only talked about the Buffalo like one time on the podcast, and it was the negative Buffalo. It was the Phyrexian Buffalo where, like, the card does a lot of different. Anyway, yeah, Tiny Bones is cool. I think it's a sweet design. I was being facetious, but I like Typhoid Rats with upside. I just like little death touchers. But we have an uncommon black 1-drop that might arguably be better than Tiny Bones here.
Potentially, yeah. So I just want to note, like, this is another, like, playable black 1-drop, and I've always been a fan of black aggro as a deck, even before it was like the 1-drops were of any kind of, like, remarkable quality at all. And this was years ago now, like maybe actually it was when Knight of the Ebon Legion came out. Or no, it was when Neo came out, because they were talking about Okiba Reckoner Raid as, like, potentially one of the best aggressive black 1-drops that had been printed, which, like, I could see a case for that, like, at the time. And basically, like, the conversation went something along the lines of, like, black aggro is, like, not there yet. It might be eventually, but they're printing, like, playable black 1-drops at, like, a glacially slow pace. We were getting, like, 1 a year, and now we're getting, like, 2 per set. So it's one of those situations where, like, this is a card type that I've been, like, begging for them to push for an extended period of time, but now we're just, like, drowning in it, you know? It's like being in the desert and, like, begging for a glass of water, and somebody just, like, waterboards you with, like, 4 gallons of water. It's just too much. But I do like this card. I like the art on this card. It's called Forsaken Miner. It is a single black mana for a 2/2 that can't block, which on face value is just worse than Diregraph Ghouls. However, when you commit a crime, you may pay 1 black. If you do, return Forsaken Miner from your graveyard to the battlefield. So, as we've discussed, black is really good at targeting things, exiling things from graveyards, what have you. So there's just, like, a lot of ways in black to commit crimes. At which point, like, being able to recur this for a single black mana is pretty nuts, even if you're not getting, like, dumb combo value out of it. And you could recur this a lot of times with a Blood Artist on board, because Blood Artist targets your opponent, which counts. So you can just, like, sack it, target with Blood Artist, replay it, sack it, target with Blood Artist, replay it, which I'm sure someone is going to die to that combo at some point. And notably, it also works with Goblin Bombardment, because Goblin Bombardment targets things, so, you know, sack it, ping a thing, pay a black, bring it back, sack it, etc. So I think it's a solid recursive 1-drop on its own, and then it has some of these combo elements to it as well. I guess what we're going to have to see is whether it is better to have, like, a 2/2 that can't block that can be recurred cheaply when you commit a crime, or if it's better to have something like Dread Wanderer, which is like a 2/1 tapped that can eventually block and can be recurred for 3 mana. My instinct is that this is better because, like, unless you're playing against a control deck, like, you're probably not recurring Dread Wanderer more than once in a game and also be in a winning position if that's what you're doing with 3 mana multiple times, right? And, like, even if you just recur Forsaken Miner once, you're going to do it so cheaply that you're going to be able to do other shit on your turn. And I really think you'll need to bring this back one time for it just to be a great card.
Also, being a 2/2 is unbelievably relevant. The number of times your, like, black aggro creature, the 2/1s just get blocked by a random token or 1/2 or 1/3 or whatever, you know. The second point of toughness here is pretty relevant, and I think this card is much better than Dread Wanderer, like leagues better than Dread Wanderer.
My instinct is that you're right, yeah.
Shout out to Tiny Bones plus Forsaken Miner, both skeletons for anti-cult conscript purposes.
Also, when you cast your card off your Tiny Bones out of your opponent's graveyard, you've targeted them, so now you can recur your Miner.
I mean, the idea of going, like, as much as I hate it, the idea of going, like, Thoughtseize You, just pay a black to get a 2/2 on board is kind of disgusting. Like, we got another criminal card here to talk about. Chris, this one looked like... I want to mention real quick before you actually talk about the card that somebody on Twitter, I think their name is Bonsai Entertainment, told me that it looks like he's wearing Mickey Mouse ears in the art, and I cannot, like, not see it anymore. Like, it straight up looks like he has Mickey Mouse ears on.
He does. He's like... Wow, he's like horror movie Mickey Mouse. Oh, it's a cowboy hat, but the top of the cowboy hat is on fire, obscuring the cowboy hat.
It's Disney ears.
Okay.
All right, talk to me about Karavek.
Karavek the Punisher. I don't know if this is like an old legendary creature or not.
Yeah, it is.
Oh, it is. Okay.
Yeah.
Karavek the Punisher. 1 black for a 3/3. Whenever you commit a crime, exile up to 1 target black card from your graveyard and copy it. You may cast the copy. If you do, you lose 2 life. So, like, as we mentioned, like, the black as a color, it's a lot easier to target things, commit crimes, whatever. So I think that, like, crime commission cards probably tend to function best in black with graveyard exile, targeting, hand disruption, blood artist, all that stuff. So... at base, this is a 3-mana 3/3 that if you remove a creature or Thoughtseize somebody or whatever, you can cast a card out of your graveyard. Which, as a base, I think is fine, but it requires a little bit more setup than I want out of a black 3-drop for our own cube. Not for us, I don't think, but I do think the base rate is, like, fine. I think once upon a time, this is a card we would have been interested in. Now we just have, like, so many black 3-drops that's just like, this is a good black, like Preacher of the Schism. It's just like, hi, I'm a 2/4 Death Touch that draws cards and makes dudes, and it always does the thing. I think we're past the point where this is something that we're personally interested in for our 360, but this is an interesting text box that I'm sure someone somewhere will break absolutely in half.
I'm sure you could do better, but the thing that jumps out to me is, like, Dark Ritual, Get Probe You, cast Dark Ritual again, play 6 mana worth of cards.
Yeah. Notably, it can cast gold cards out of your graveyard as long as there's black in them, so you could cast, like, a Kolaghan's Command or something like that from your graveyard with this. Also,
Strix.
It gives me huge Braids vibes, the DMU Braids, like 1 black 3/3 that's doing, like, a pretty specific thing, and, like, that card didn't quite pan out for us, so I can't imagine, like, a card that's following the same exact patterns as that card is going to pan out, but I admit it is a very cool text box. There's I don't know if you guys know it, but the original, or not original, but there's an Umezawa from, like, Champions of Kamigawa that does a very similar thing where when you kill an opponent's creature, you can cast a black spell from your graveyard, and you just, like, chain together, like, black removal spells and stuff like that. This one, obviously, you lose 2 for each one you cast, so you can't, like, go crazy, but it is a really cool text box. I like unique stuff like this. Snorse time. I don't know if I think we should run it, but it's, like, interesting enough, and it generated enough discussion that I thought that we should talk about it. So this is called Caustic Bronco. It's 1 and a black for a 2/2 Snake Horse Mount. Which, I mean, they're really wiling out with these creature types these days. Notably, it doesn't have Death Touch, even though the snake head is, like, dripping a bunch of green venom from its jaws. And it's called Caustic Bronco.
Tim, I think you said it. Like, this card almost certainly had Death Touch at one point, and then they were just like, no, this can't have Death Touch. Because whenever it attacks, you reveal the top card of your library and put it into your hand. You lose life equal to that card's mana value if Caustic Bronco isn't saddled. Otherwise, each opponent loses that much life, and it has saddle 3. So to unpack, basically, it's a 2/2 that when it attacks, you bob. And if it's saddled, you bob, but your opponent loses life. The saddle cost being 3 is like pretty high. I think the only time that you're gonna like see that happen is if somebody like casts Bronco on 2 and then like Woe Strider on 3 and then taps the Woe Strider to just get like, I think you're gonna saddle this with larger creatures that you play after it, if that makes any sense, right? In your black aggro deck, you're not gonna tap like 2/2/2 attackers to saddle Caustic Bronco most of the time. This card would have been incredibly powerful if it had Death Touch, because it just always kind of presents your opponent with like a losing proposition. Without keywords, the way that I read this card is if you resolve it on 2 and like back it up with Disruption, it can just take over a game, and if you play it on turn 5, it's a 2-mana 2/2.
Yeah, I mean, that's how the card plays out. It does nothing on defense, so that's kind of a knock against it. That's where having Death Touch might have been too much, is that this is a huge card draw value engine on offense, but you can always just trade it off for your opponent's biggest thing on defense, and they wanted to... They showed some restraint, like, this is what I wish more Magic cards looked like, but the thing that gets me is Saddle 3, like, how much does that make or break the card? Because Crew 3 on a vehicle is usually, like, the point
too
where
high.
we're like, probably not, right? We're probably not interested in that. I mean, if this was just 2-mana 2/2 attack Bob and like no other text, like you ignore the whole like flip the damage on your opponent instead of you saddle thing, like would we still be interested in that?
I think without a keyword, I think it's too boom or bust, right? It's like one of those cards, kind of like Magda, where it like if it comes down on 2 and you just like get a couple of good attacks off with it, maybe back it up with burn, it just like is a 2-mana 2/1 that generated 1 mana. Caustic Bronco, if you like play this on 2 and then like your next turn you like push your opponent's like 2-drop play and play another 2-drop and attack with this, like there's just like the potential for this to kind of run away with the game very quickly, and then in other circumstances it's just going to be a bear. And you know, see our last episode on Polarity, we don't really like cards that are like dynamite or terrible depending on what's going on the battlefield, unless they cost like 1 mana.
Yeah, I agree with you, Chris. It's very much a boomer card. This is the kind of card that like 10 years ago would have been a cool card. You know, it just it's not there. And also it does have the thing of, like you said, Polarity is really good against blue decks, right? Because your blue deck's playing less creatures. You got your Doom Blades are gonna open this up more. They're not pressuring your life total, all that sort of stuff. So I mean, I just don't think this gets there without a keyword. Even something like Jund, they want their creatures to pull double duty. You just can't, like, this doesn't block very well, so it's just kind of not there. Death Touch probably makes this too much. I mean, they could have just said maybe
Menace.
Well, they could have said, I think that might be worse in some ways, but I think they could have said maybe Death Touch when attacking, and that would have been fair.
Yeah, that I think that would be a lot more fair. We should probably move on because red and green have actually quite a few creatures to talk about, so we'll have to be sleek about these. Some of them are just mentions when we get to green, but red actually has quite a bit of power packed into this set in the creature specifically, starting with Slick Shot Show Off. This is 1 in a red for a 1/2 rare bird wizard with flying, haste, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. It also has plot for 1 in a red, so just as a reminder, you can pay 1 in a red at sorcery speed to exile it face up. On a later turn at sorcery speed, you can cast it for free if it's plotted. So 2 mana, 1/2 flying haste with super prowess basically, and it's the good prowess where it's not instant or sorcery specifically, it's non-creature, so you cast your Mishra's Bubble. So my question is, obviously this is really good in any sort of like spells mattery kind of thing. It's going to be hitting for 3 in the air pretty often. What are my incentives to actually plot this instead of casting it? What kind of advantages does that give us? And do you think we're going to be actually plotting this often or just running it out on turn 2?
I think the only spot where you're going to have an incentive to plot this is probably against controlling decks. And the reason that I think that is, like, if you play this out on 2 an attack, you only get in 1 damage, right? Because you can't follow it up with anything, assuming that you're not playing free spells. So if you plot it, you're only missing out on 1 damage. And then, like, on turn 3, if you just, like, shit it out with plot and then you lightning strike, lightning bolt, like, if your opponent tapped out for something or whatever, you're going to get sort of, like, guaranteed value. The other reason I could see to plot this, again, against controlling decks, is if you've already built a little bit of a board state that's going to, like, clock your opponent in, like, 4 or 5 turns, and you're just like, okay, well, basically the only way that I lose here is if you, like, wrath me and clean up my entire hand. So I'm just going to hold, like, this and some burn, and then if you wrath me, I can just, like, spit this out and, like, do 7 damage to you in 1 turn. I think against most mid-range decks and other aggressive non-red decks, you're probably just supposed to, like, play this. I think it's kind of a hedge against blue.
I think it's more than blue. I think there's some spots where, like, your opponent, like, on turn 2 holds up, you know, black plus X, and you just, like, it's not necessarily just control, but, like, the idea of your opponent holding up removal, and you just plot this to set yourself up for a future turn, letting you spend your mana without actually having to commit it to the board. You know, we play at this point like 4 black rats or 3 black rats. We've got a number of those along with the white ones. So, I mean, there are a number of decks that aren't necessarily hardcore control decks that'll be playing those. And even against some of the green decks, a lot of their removal is sorcery speed. So if you have a good hand for this, are you willing to trade 1 point of damage to be able to play around your opponent killing it and you losing the 4 damage it would have dealt on the next turn, right?
Right, with like a fight creature or whatever.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of little hedges here that this plot will allow, but I think this is one of the cooler uses of plot on haste because it lets you really think about what your opponent is likely to have and how your hand interacts. Because, like, if you don't have a lot of non-creature spells, you probably are okay just running this out and forcing them to use their removal spell.
Yeah, and this completely shafts counterspell on tempo. Right, like I hold up my 2 mana counter and it's like, okay, I see what you're doing. I'm going to spend my mana anyway. I'm not going to lose like any tempo in the mana investment. Yeah, and you know, I didn't even think about the case that you mentioned, Teld, but if you're playing against like a black mid-range deck and they're like clearly holding up Doomblade, you know, and they're just going to like Doomblade whatever your 2-drop is, you just plot this, and then they might even be like, well, fuck, I don't want to lose this tempo, so I guess I'm Doomblading the 1-drop instead of wasting my turn, at which point you're even more open to kick the shit out of them with this. Right. So, yeah, I think the plot actually... I think of all the plot cards I've seen, I think that this is the one that has the most cases where you're going to want to plot it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're going to talk about another one here in just a second, but just to iterate on a point that Teld made there is haste is really good with plot, because for most of the plot cards, you're paying the same amount of mana functionally, but you're giving up a turn's worth of attacks because you're not attacking with it that turn, you're not attacking with it the next turn, but haste gives you back the damage that you would have dealt. And like Chris said, you miss a point of damage by not casting this right away and then plotting it instead and casting it the next turn, but you can like stockpile non-creature spells and stuff like that and go for 1 big turn as well. Also really good with anything that cares about multi-spelling, like again, Clarion Spirit. There aren't that many cards like that, but I can imagine there are things that get better the more spells you cast, for limited especially. But so let's keep moving here. We've got a lot of red to talk about. Magda the Horde Master is up next. 1 in a red for a 2/2 rare legendary Dwarf Berserker. Whenever you commit a crime, create a tapped treasure token. This ability only triggers once each turn. So interact with your opponent, get a tapped treasure token. Additionally, sacrifice 3 treasure tokens at sorcery speed to create a 4/4 red scorpion dragon token with flying and haste.
Our token's having 2 creature types now.
Yeah, well, actually, I do think one thing I really like about this plane is that the dragons are scorpions, but at the same time, they reprinted Terror of the Peaks, which is just a regular dragon, so it makes that reprint look a little weirder, but I do like scorpion dragon. Yeah. It just appeals to that, like, little kid in me, but... 2 mana, 2/2, target your opponent, get a treasure. Tap treasure, so you can't use it to, like, just chain off spells in the same turn. And then if you ever stockpile 3 treasures, you just get a 4/4 flying haste off of this. No drawback. It doesn't sacrifice end of turn or anything like that. You can only do it sorcery speed. But haste as well, like, I just assumed it made a 4/4, and you're like, nope, this makes hasty creatures. And it's like, okay.
Yeah, this card seems incredible. Like, this card is amazing. I don't know what to say. Like, it's just, you play it on 2... And like it starts generating treasures, but then not only does it generate treasures, it bypasses the problem treasures have of like not scaling into the game by just letting you cash out your treasures for giant hasty tokens. This card's great.
Yeah, and you said you thought it would be good enough if it didn't even do the dragon thing, right?
Oh yeah. The dragon thing is like total bonus. I mean, like there's more and more ways to make treasures in Magic, so I assume this is going to come up more. I don't remember how many we have in the cube, but like this is good. This is just a really good card. Red's the best color at committing crimes, I think. So I'm assuming this is just going to be just absurd.
You see this a lot in artifact themed cubes. The red section will have a treasure theme.
Yeah.
So like, I mean, honestly, like this might even be a little busted in your like red treasure deck, because even if you draw this in the late game, you just like play this and then immediately just make a 4/4 hasted flyer off the treasures you have lying around that, you know, you're like tapping for improvise or, you know, whatever you're using them for that's not mana.
Oh yeah, this is just Marionette Master number 2 for the Affinity Cube, huh?
This is an Infinity Cube. Can you imagine, like, Treasure Map's a cool card, but Treasure Map that makes a 4/4 flying haste and like when it flips is way cooler. I do want to note this is going to come up on another card later as well, but when it says this ability triggers only once each turn, that means that you can target your opponent's stuff on their turn to get a treasure and target something on your turn to get a treasure. So you can kind of, if you have enough instant speed interaction or maybe an activated ability that can target something, like Goblin Bombardment's going to come up a couple more times this episode, but that's a way to commit crimes on your opponent's turns pretty consistently. So
my only concern with the card is, again, like seeing the polarity conversation, that this might just be like, I dunk on you now on turn 2, and then as like a draw late when you're not working with a lot of resources, it might not be great. But like even red has plenty of ways to see more cards and generate resources these days. And frankly, like the highest mana value where I'm like, this is a really bad late game draw, so like I absolutely don't want to think about it, is like 3. I think on a 2-drop, not being the world's best late game draw is like not the end of the world.
It's okay. Chris, you added a little 1-drop here. I'm actually surprised to see you on the list, but I want to hear what you think about it.
Okay, so I'm going to, again, preface this card for anybody who's not in the arena card pool, that if you have all of the red 1-drops of all time, especially if you're willing to play Ragavan, which we are not, then this card is like it's not even playing the same sport.
Well, this card's better than Ragavan, right? It blocks it and trades one for 0.
Oh, yeah.
It beats Ragavan.
So we're only really talking about this card because like we still have some quality holes in our red 1-drop section, because we don't have like Goblin Guide, we don't have Zergo, we do have Ragavan, but we refuse to play that card. So this is Reckless Lackey. It's 1 red for a 1/2 first strike haste. If the stat line was inverted, it would be like one of the most busted red 1-drops of all time. But you can pay 2 and a red to sacrifice it, draw a card, and create a treasure token. So the way that I see this card playing out as a 1-drop is like, you're going to peck in on turn 1. You're probably going to peck in again on turn 2. Maybe it's not like something that you can attack with profitably on turn 3, but like later in the game, if you're just like swinging out, this is going to get in damage because your opponent's going to be incentivized to try to trade with your better creatures. And then when you hit a point in the game where it's like not relevant at all, you can trade it in to draw a card, and effectively it's 2 mana to sack it and draw a card because you're making a treasure token and the treasure token is not tapped. Notably, I think that this is going to be an even better red 1-drop for our peasant environments and maybe other peasant environments as well than it would be in like an unrestricted context, because peasant environments tend to have more ways to put +1/+1 counters on things. Red specifically is not a color that distributes a whole lot of +1/+1 counters, unless like the creature's putting +1/+1 counters on itself. Like there's not a lot of red stuff that puts +1/+1 counters on like target creature. Notably, hey guys, we broke Inti. Like, Inti can just make this, like, progressively larger. Wow. This wears Bone Splitter like a fucking champion. I mean, the second we get, like, more high-quality, rare red 1-drops, like, this is no longer be in the conversation. But I think that this is just, like, a decent little red 1-drop for the arena card pool.
Yeah, I think there's just a number of good things going on here with it. It's got, you know, good enough stat line with, like, a buyout mode, on top of the fact that it plays really, really well in Boros specifically, which we've seen do pretty well lately. There's a lot of little things, especially when you start breaking into other color combinations, that let this thing do some work. It sacks itself, so if you're in red-black, it's going to be able to guarantee that even if you don't have a sack outlet, you can get your Blood Artist trigger. So a lot of little edges. Again, like you said, if you're playing with the most powerful cards of Magic's history, this is probably not going to get there, but this is pretty pushed, I feel.
It's a lot of words on a one drop.
Yeah, a couple other just quick edges on it. If you attack into your opponent's board and they just like throw a 3 toughness creature in front of this, shock, all of a sudden like your shock is kill their 3 toughness creature. And in addition to that, against other aggressive decks or tokens decks, when you can no longer attack with this, 1/2 first strike is going to like profitably block Savannah Lions. 2 mana 3/1s, like you can't attack into this with like Intrepid Adversary or whatever. So in an aggressive matchup, this can pivot pretty quickly from like chipping in a couple points of damage to just bricking a whole lot of their X1 creatures. So for us, it has enough edges, I think, to be worth testing. We fully acknowledge that if you're not limited to the arena card pool, like, you could have like skipped this section.
Mm-hmm. The rest of red here is a lot of question marks. There's some really interesting designs that it's hard to tell how these cards are going to play out. But the first one here is Stingerback Terror. 2 red for a 7/7 fly. I can't even say it with a straight face. 2 red, 7/7 fly and trample rare scorpion dragon. But wait, there's a drawback. It gets -1/-1 for each card in your hand. Drawback in quotes.
A drawback in Modern Magic?
It has plot for 2 in a red, so notably this one's actually cheaper to plot than its normal casting cost. And plot does seem relevant as well. So 7/7's a little bit of a lie, right? Because if you play out a land every turn, you cast this on turn 4, you're still probably going to have 2 to 3 cards in hand, unless you go literally 1 drop, 2 drop, 3 drop, or you just have all 1 drops and you get to like slam your hand down. Maybe you aggressively mulligan to make this card better or something. But I think if you play this on turn 4, we're probably assuming it's like 4/4 a lot of the time. I think that's just kind of like a good average case. Maybe if you're a really aggressive deck and this is a good top end for you, like this is the only 4 drop in your deck, like you can get it down to like 1 or 2 cards in your hand. You can also plot it and then wait for a turn where you are going to empty out your hand and then have this come down as like the big 7/7 or whatever. It gives me Hazoret vibes in the sense that like Hazoret is another really aggressive beater that wants you to empty your hand as fast as possible. I don't know. If you're in a low curve deck, this is just very often going to be bashing for 5 or 6 in the air with haste. Or it doesn't have haste.
No, it doesn't have haste. I think it would have been pretty crazy with plot and haste.
Yeah.
It's flying trample. I'm sorry if I said haste a couple times there, but it's flying trample. So it can't just come down swinging the turn that you play it, whether you plotted it or not. I think I'm thinking of the slick shot that has haste. But, I mean, very often, 4 mana... 5/5, there's this weird little rigmarole where, like, on your draw step, you're going to draw a card, and it's going to shrink, and your opponent has an opportunity to, like, kill it while it's slightly smaller with a specific kind of burn spell, but as soon as it gets to your main phase, you drop a land, it gets bigger, you cast a spell. Like, once you have this card on board, or even once you've plotted it, your whole game plan becomes, how do I empty my hand as fast as possible and kill you over the course of 2 or 3 turns?
This strikes me as the kind of card that, maybe this doesn't happen, but it strikes me as the kind of card that will enable some very silly constructed things where you find a way to plot a couple of these, give them haste, and you just like attack your opponent for, 10, 12 damage in the air out of nowhere. And like, that probably isn't enough of a payoff given the kind of wild things that are going on in constructed formats at the moment. I think the big question here is how reliably are you dumping your hand? Because one of the downsides of a card like this is it's sort of got that Hell Rider kind of vibe where I'm just never playing this in my Junge style deck or like my blue-red deck or anything like that. You kind of have to be this like committed, low to the ground red deck. And then you do get a pretty overstated creature, but the lack of haste means that, when you start talking about 4 and 5 mana red creatures, for aggressive decks, you do really want them to have haste. So I have some question marks around this one, but the stat line is certainly there. It's very impressive.
Yeah, I think it would have been a lot more interesting and maybe too powerful if it was like flying, it gets -1/-1 for each card in your hand, and like if this card was cast from exile, it gains haste this turn or something. So like that plays, like if you just like dump your hand and then like play it out, it doesn't have haste, but if you plot it and wait till you dump your hand, you cast it from exile, then it's this huge thing. I think the lack of haste hurts this, because, like, let me ask you guys this. If you have 2 cards left in your hand, and this is a 5/5 flying trample, is that better than, like, at Sushi, which is a 4/4 flying trample that either gives you mana or cards when it dies? Probably not.
Or like Rekindling Phoenix and its resiliency to removal. There's a lot of question marks here about, like, I think at 4 mana, you just want it to be more resilient.
I agree, and I think that if we were going to play a card that really wants you to just completely dump your fucking hand out, it would probably be Hazaret over this, right? Because Hazaret is, like, indestructible and has haste, and it, you know, it can be chump blocked or whatever, but, I mean, Hazaret is just so much more durable.
Sure, correct me if I'm wrong, is it Hazaret on the we don't play this because it's busted list of cards?
No, I don't think so.
It's not on the we don't play it because it's busted. It's on the it's fucking obnoxious against control decks specifically. Not to mention the fact that, like, you have to be playing a hand vomit deck, and this also requires you to play a hand vomit deck.
Gotcha.
So I'm not making the case that, like, we should be playing this card. I'm saying that, like, if I'm stacking this up as a card against Hazaret in a deck that is, like, asking for it to do very similar things, for it to be doing the thing, I think I'd rather have Hazaret in my deck than
this.
I
think the TLDR is that I think our current 4s that we play in red are just substantially more resilient or flexible. Like, they give you the ability to play a longer game, and they let you kind of do what you need your more expensive cards to do, which is not just die to a Doomblade and have you go down cards, right?
Right. The art on this card is fucking sweet.
Scorpion dragons are
cool. It is cool
looking. Yeah, no, it is. It's a cool looking piece of cardboard, and, like, if you're into cards that have this kind of mechanic, like, they're huge, but they get -1/-1, you know, depending on, like, circumstances, which is a mechanic that I think some people are, like, into. This is a cool card, and if you're into that, you should play it. My last note on this card is it's kind of funny. This is like a cool dragon that will actually suck in Dragon Cube, because all of the dragons are so expensive, you're always going to have, like, 5 cards in your hand.
Sure. Yeah. Also, just, like, half the cards on this list, just this is going to come down retail eliminated. You're gonna groan.
Yeah. There was a blue card. It was a Geralf's Masterpiece or something from one of the Shadows over Innistrad sets. It had the same ability. It was also a 7/7 for 5 or whatever. And I remember that being a big pet card of mine. Like, it was always a 6/6 or 7/7 in retail limited, but it was a 5-drop, so you emptied your hand a little bit more. Chris just coming with the bangers here on the red cards. Talk to me about Calamity. Calamity's the horse, right? Yeah, Calamity is the horse, not the dude on the horse.
I believe that's
because the creature type's horse mount. Yeah, Calamity's another interesting one that I'm actually surprised to see you put on the list, given that it's a 6-drop. But talk to me about it.
Okay, so this is Calamity Galloping Inferno. It's 4 red for a 4/6 horse mount with haste. Whenever it attacks while saddled, choose a non-legendary creature that's saddled it this turn and create a tapped and attacking token that's a copy of it. Sacrifice that token at the beginning of the next end step. Repeat this process once. And notably, it has a saddle of 1. So there's literally not a single red card that can attack that can't saddle this, right? And at some point in the game, like, your 2/1's, like, not getting in for damage on its own, so you can just saddle this and attack with, like, a 4/6 haste that also spits out, you know, 2/1 attackers, or, you know, whatever. I added this because there are enough different powerful red 6-drops at this point. And in a 360 card cube, you probably don't want more than 1. It's just kind of like pick your poison at this point. I'm not interested in playing this over Inferno Titan. I don't even know that I'm interested in playing this over the Carnosaur that we passed on, because it is a 6-drop that asks a little bit of your board state, which in red is not, like, it's not a big ask, right? Like, if you don't have any creatures on board as an attacking red deck, you're probably losing. And this is just like a 6 mana 4/6 haste at that point. I don't think that's going to come up very often, but if you're looking for a different, you know, slam, holy shit, red 6-drop creature, this is an option for you. It's not my favorite. I just wanted to call it out because I think it does enough powerful things that if you want to play an expensive red creature, you know, and in Gruul, like copying big green things is kind of fucking nuts.
Yeah, that would be insane, right?
Get on the horse.
Get on the horse. Let's distribute like 8 +1/+1 counters. I think when you start getting into colors other than red, this gets really cool. I think this is the coolest 6-drop threat available in red on the client. Like this card enables, this is the kind of card that gets like the Johnny side of my brain really rolling of like, what are the silliest things we can do? I mean, you got some obvious cards that would be good with it, like, you know, Blade Splicer or whatever. There's like regular value creatures, but you know, like the Verdurous Gear Hulks or the, you know, the really ambitious, like multicolor kind of nonsense you could do with this. I don't think this is like the most powerful thing you could be doing. I think Inferno Titan has that solidly locked up and Carnosaur is not far behind. But if you're looking for just something that is still powerful but really, really cool, I think this could go into your slot there.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that this could be like pretty strong in the Arena Cube because they just kind of refuse to enable really fast curve out decks. So, you know, your aggressive decks end up a little bit more mid-rangey and you might want a 6-drop in there. I think the reason I'm not interested in it is if I'm gonna play a 6-drop red creature, I don't want to play one that it's like, holy shit, can you imagine what you can do if you curve up to 6 mana? Right, I want it to be a creature that it catches me up on value or board state for 6 mana.
Sure.
So I'm not saying that I don't think this is a powerful card. I put it on the list for a reason. I thought it was interesting to talk about. I think that this would be really fun in some cubes. It's going to certainly create some story moments. Like, doubling a creature with like an ETB value that's also a decent size is going to be fucking insane. I prefer my 6-drop creatures to be catch-up cards, not slam-the-door cards.
If you're at parity or ahead when you cast this, you're probably just instantly in the game. But yeah, like this is, like I said, this is more of a cool card than one that I think is slam dunk. You know, we should play this in a cube type deal.
Yeah, it is very good with a gold card that I'm going to mention later, which is also like kind of mid, but they go well together. Chris is just a sucker for what is it, Crested Sunmare, so he went through and added every horse in the set to the list. He's like, got to
my first constructed deck ever, Crested Sunmare, baby.
Let me catch this next one here because it's fun to say. Hellspur Posse Boss is 2 red for a 2/4 rare lizard rogue. I don't know if you guys know this or not, but they're not using the Viashino creature type anymore. It's just lizard from now on. So if you see a Viashino, it is just lizard.
It is really fun to say. Hellspur Posse Boss.
Hellspur Posse Boss is 2/4 for 4. It says other outlaws you control have haste. So again, assassins, mercenaries, pirates, rogues, and warlocks. And when it enters the battlefield, you make 2 of those mercenary tokens, the 1/1s that can tap at sorcery speed to give a creature +1/+0. Notably, those will have haste because mercenaries are outlaws. So, I mean, this is running up against, for us specifically, Red Cap Gutter Dweller, which is a 4-drop that we added to support our sacrifice decks. It's been quite good. It's just all around a fantastic value card that's also 4 mana for 3 bodies. I think this is in the conversation. I don't know where I land on one versus the other being better, but you know, at face value, this is 4 mana for 4/6 worth of stats, 2 of which can either attack right away as 1/1s or use their activated abilities to like pump up some evasive creature you have or something like that. You go like Phoenix of Ash on turn 3 into Hellspur Posse Boss on turn 4, and you just tap those mercenaries to make your Phoenix hit for additional damage. I don't think this card is super impressive. It's not as cool as some of the other ones, but at 4 mana, I think the whole 3 bodies for 1 card is still relevant. This one itself is a 2/4. It doesn't pump itself or give itself haste. There are some incidental other like pirates and rogues that will occasionally get haste off of this, but not enough that you can actually say that's like a draw towards the card. So I was just curious, for the purposes of comparing to Red Cap Gutter Dweller specifically, how you guys felt about this card. But I think as a standalone card in a vacuum, it's got the stats to pull its weight.
Yeah, it's definitely good. I think for our purposes, I kind of lean towards the Gutter Dweller. I think like we're trying to support a black-red sack deck. It's very, very good there. I think the menace there makes it a much better aggressive finisher, which is kind of where we slotted it in anyways. The card advantage adds up over the course of the game. That being said, I think this card has a couple of really powerful niches. I think one, it's much better if you're trying to stabilize. Like Gutter Dweller is notably terrible when you're behind. It is not a card that blocks very well. The base body is
the rats.
Can't block at all. It's a baseline 3/3 until you untap with it. So if you aren't at parity, Gutter Dweller does have some issues. I will also say, like I said in the intro we were doing, that I think these mercenary tokens are going to play out much more powerfully than they look. I think this looks kind of mid on the mercenaries, but I think they're going to play really well. And I think if you're trying to not die, or if you're in like a racing situation, I think this card adds a lot more in the like aggro versus aggro matchups, where this is a big defensive body your opponent needs to answer, but also you're able to set up your attacks a little better, or you could just have like 3 blockers available to you. So this is actually a discussion we need to have, I think, is like the intrinsic synergy and overall amount of grindy value / aggressive power that the Gutter Dweller provides better than this sort of more flexible defensive creature, or like more well-rounded defensive creature maybe.
Yeah, it falls in line with like, it's a good card in a vacuum. Will it make the cube? I don't know. It's competing with other things in the same card slot, but I think as its own standalone thing, it has the stats to rumble, and it's fun to say Hellspur Posse Boss.
I used to see Pia and Kieran Noir in a lot of cubes, and I think that unless you have an artifact theme, this is probably just better.
Doesn't
Probably.
it make 2 Thopters?
The 1/1 flyers are, yeah, but I mean the base body's a 2/2. The Thopters, I mean, I could go back and forth on those. It's in that same like 2 red. Here's 3 bodies. Like, what are you doing with those bodies type thing?
Because if you think about it, Pia and Kieran Noir is just Whirler Rogue with 3 mana sack and artifact. It deals 2 damage to target creature or player,
like
which is
debatably worse than Whirler Rogue's ability.
Yeah, I mean these days the ability activation is like a little slow. You know,
for sure.
For like what you're getting. Anyway, this is like a solid enough card. It's not really doing anything particularly like thematic or interesting, but like the stats are there.
Yeah. Teld, you've got one you wanna pitch here. I can already hear the words coming off of Chris's lips on this one, but
yes. So this is Return the Favor. It is a spree card, so its base cost is red, but you'll never cast it for that. It's an instant, and we go +1. We get to copy target instant, sorcery, activated ability, or triggered ability, and we can choose new targets. The other one is +1, change the target of target spell or ability with a single target. So this is just kind of a sweet fork variant. I think the 3 mana modes on this are going to be fairly weak, but I think this card's really cool at 4 mana, where your opponent, plays a card and we essentially it's like a red counter spell, right? Our opponent plays a Doomblade and we redirect the Doomblade to one of their creatures. We copy the Doomblade and kill something. It's even got those ability triggers to be able to copy or change abilities that could come up from time to time. I'm not actually pitching this for the unrestricted cube necessarily. I don't think it's there, but this was just a really, really sweet card. It's got great art, and this is the kind of card that I just think is very, very cool. And I just like to shout those out from time to time because, so we're so focused on like the incredible stat lines on creatures sometimes that, sometimes it's nice to just be like, man, this card does some wild things.
Mm-hmm. It's cool. Fork plus misdirection in the same card is a cool design. Obviously, those aren't things that like we actively have a need for in our cube. Like if I was playing someone else's cube and this showed up, I'd be like, okay, there's probably some cool things going on with this, but I don't think it's the type of card we would make room for ourselves.
Yep.
Yeah, Chris had no words for it. That does move us into green, where we get to talk about a bunch of creatures again. So the first one here is Free Strider Lookout. It's 2 and a green for a 3/3 rare rogue. Everything's a rogue in this set. Holy crap. It has reach. So 3 mana, 3/3 reach. Whenever you commit a crime, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may put a land from among them on the battlefield tapped. The rest go on the bottom, and this ability triggers only once each turn. So commit a crime, get a land, basically. It doesn't even have to be non-basic, so I don't know what the geometric math on that is, but I'm assuming you're hitting every single time. It is worth noting, Chris mentioned top of the episode, green is the worst at committing crime because it just has less stuff that it targets with. It has fight spells, and then it might have occasionally like these activated abilities like Scavenging Ooze and Armored Scrap Gorger, which are actually kind of nuts with this because they can commit crimes on both players' turns. But I mean, 3 mana, 3/3, target your thing. Rampant Growth, that's pretty powerful baseline. 3/3 reach rather too. So it's a defensive green card. I like having a couple defensive green cards in a world full of like pushed hyper powerful aggressive green cards. Obviously does like kind of the Jundy get value over time thing, but I don't see anything to really be disappointed in this card, and it just seems like a cool value card.
I do not have high expectations for this card. My issue is that green, as we mentioned, is the worst at targeting things. Our green decks, in our cube specifically, tend to be quite green, which exacerbates that problem. And when you like untap on 4 mana, then I guess you want to be targeting something and getting a land that turns. Like the next turn, you can play a 6-drop, but like later in the game, the fishing up a land doesn't really matter. I mean, notably, you can get a non-basic land card, which is cool if you have like utility lands that have powerful ETBs or something. What I don't think it's ever going to be like super disappointing necessarily because it's like a 3/3 reach, but I feel like in a green deck you like maybe trigger this once and you don't have very much control over when you trigger it, which means when you trigger it, it might not be particularly relevant that you triggered it. My personal opinion is that Llanowar Visionary is better than this card.
Was that up for discussion? I didn't realize that.
I don't think this would be the card we compare, because that card is just such a
The card's great.
like consistent role player in every deck you put it in. The thing is, I think in a heavy green deck, like your green ramp deck or something, this card probably isn't something you want. But I think if you're green X, where X is something that's like equivalent to the number of green cards you have, you're just going to pick up all of the crime committing cards from that deck. Plus, I mean, some people do play multicolor. The Omnath deck and stuff like that is going to have crimes, and you're going to want the lands and things like that. So I don't think this is a green card for heavy green decks. I think it is a green card for
your
like
Jund deck.
Equivalent, like 2-color decks, Jund decks, maybe not green white specifically, but yeah, green black, green red, I think could make good use out of it.
I think this card is just doing the Jund 2-for-1 thing, right? We play this, especially if you get to like play it on turn 4 and you pair it with like a cut down or something, and you get to immediately get some value out of it. It obviously is pretty good. Having reach, I also think for green decks is low key very powerful, because a lot of the ways that the green decks lose is just your opponent having like, a fairy mastermind and hitting you a bunch of times.
Blocks the dumb 5/3 Sphinx.
Tangles with the Sphinx.
Yeah, I think that reach is a very powerful keyword that is oft underrated in Magic.
The only other thing I would say is, like, in a Jund deck, in our cube, you might have some trouble finding room for this in a world with, like, Breaches and Squee and Glissa and Preacher of the Schism. Sure. At a certain point, I think you're going to kind of run out of room for 3-drops, but I think it's going to be towards the bottom end of green 3-drops that I'm interested in picking.
I can see that for sure. I think this is worse than Sentinel of the Nameless City, even in the decks you would want to play this in, obviously.
Oh, yeah.
I'll try to convince you of it a little more off air, but okay. I do want you to take this next one, because you just Chris is just constantly like, why can't we get good green 5-drops?
I know.
Like we just haven't had a good one in such a long time. Also, this card is fucking egregious.
Yeah, this card's pretty wild. So it is Railway Brawler, 3 green for a mythic Rhino Warrior, 5/5 reach trample. They're just like stapling a lot of reach onto seemingly every green creature these days. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you put X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is its power. And that's not like once per turn. So if you follow this up with like a huge trampler, it's like a 12/12 trample. If you follow this up by making like 4/1/1 tokens, you make 8/8 worth of power. And notably, it also has like plot for 3 and a green, which presumably you're doing to like take turn 4 off to then cast this for free on turn 5 and then immediately follow it up with like a Glory Bringer or something without like exposing this to sorcery speed removal. I think that this is a really strong stat stick. This just kind of has that quality we were talking about in the last episode, like must die to Doomblade. It's like, okay, I play this. Yep. Do you kill it? No. Okay, I'm going to shit out a massive amount of stats that you're probably not recovering from next turn. And we don't tend to enjoy those cards. This is like a category of card I would describe as nuclear Baneslayer. Like, people say Baneslayers are bad because they die to cheap removal, and that is true, but the problem with nuclear Baneslayers is they have exactly the same play pattern, but you just get so much more punished for not being able to remove it. And this is just one of those cards where it's like, next turn, I play Kogla, it's a 14/12 that eats, like, literally anything you could possibly have on board.
Well, 14, 13, but
Or 14. No, you're right. It doesn't just double the.
I mean,
yeah.
just saying.
The 4-drops are even scarier though, right? Like you follow this up with a questing beast or like an overbond oddity, and you're just like, all right, here's my 8/8 hard to block.
Whatever. Like, come on, whatever with this card. Did you have something productive to say other than this is an insane busted card?
No,
like,
they just keep printing these over and over again. They never see any constructed play. I don't know why they're printing so many of them.
Teld, you don't have to raise your hand, by the way, Teld. You can just talk, you can just interrupt it. Like, you could just
I do want to throw out here the as is common with green kind of expensive cards. We always say, turn 4, turn 5, but like you need to always remember what happens when your opponent casts this on turn 3.
Yeah.
It doubles the effect of your anthems because their power's already naturally bigger. It's not even non-token. Like whatever. There's like, it does all the things you want it to do.
It doesn't say base power, does it?
No, if you cast Tristani, Tristani becomes a 2/5, and then the tokens become 4/4 lifelinkers.
When you cast your 4th Orlingus, how many 4/4s do you make?
This next card, I'm not going to spend more than 10 seconds on it, but Colossal Rattleworm is 2 green for a 6/5 with trample and like additional text on it. That's all upside. And I think that's all we need to say about it. It's just we need to talk about the vanilla test because this is a 4-mana 6/5 trample with upside, and it's like 2 GG. So I don't want to spend any more time on this card because we're not going to play it. It's not interesting. It's just the stat lines are out of control. So let's gloss over that one and get to another saddle card here, actually. Chris, if you want to talk to us about one of the, 15 aspirant cards that we got in this set.
Yeah, so this is Ornery Tumblewag. It is a Brushwag mount. That is its creature type. It couldn't have been, Marsupial or anything more general. It had to be a Brushwag. It's 2 and a green for a 2/2. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. So baseline, it is an additional mana for Luminarch Aspirant that comes in as a 2/2. Whenever it attacks while saddled, double the number of +1/+1 counters on target creature, and then you can saddle it for 2. So I will say that most of the time, I think what you're supposed to be doing if you saddle this is to double the number of +1/+1 counters on it, because as a 2/2, if that's not what you're doing, you're probably sacrificing it in combat, unless you're making a play where you're doubling the number of +1/+1 counters on your trample creature, like your Voracious Hydra that you played for the double counters mode or whatever, and it just wins the game. Even without the saddle text, it's just Luminarch Aspirant that green decks are often going to be able to just cast on turn 2, just like a white deck casts Aspirant on turn 2, and the rest of it's just upside. Green creatures tend to be larger than power 2, right? So you're not going to want to tap down your questing beast to saddle this or whatever, but it's really not uncommon a little later in the game for your dorks to just be lying around not doing anything when you have an arbitrary amount of mana, and you can tap those to crew this. You can tap value creatures like Augur of Autumn or Courser of Krufix that you probably weren't going to try to rumble with in combat anyway, yada yada yada. It's just a good card. Thank God it doesn't have trample.
Feels like more of a what we call the Gruul beatdown deck that we don't really see a lot of lately. I think people are onto the just play Gruul as a ramp deck idea, but occasionally we still see this sort of Gruul stompy Naya Spectrum stompy deck, and I think this is a little better there. I will say this does kind of it's one of those cards that addresses a bit of an issue that the green ramp decks can run into, which is sometimes you have 2 or 3 draw steps in a row where you're kind of at board parity, but you're just both drawing cards because neither of you can make a big play. And if you whiff a couple of draw steps, sometimes it ends poorly for you. And this kind of means that if you're in those stalled games, you're still making progress on your board, which is something. It's not irrelevant.
Yeah, I mean, I think also notably, you probably don't want to be doing this too much early. You want to be putting the stats on the creatures that, will have good attacks. But one of the play patterns that you see a lot with Aspirant is you start putting the +1/+1 counters on something that you spent 1 mana on that your opponent does not want to use a premium removal spell to get rid of because you literally spent a mana on it. And on turns where you're not using a dork for mana, you can just slap a +1/+1 counter on it and have it get into combat Like over the course of a game, it's like, okay, my Llanowar elves ramped me 3 times, and now it's a 4/4, and if you Doomblade it, you're gonna feel like dog shit because that's a really bad trade. So I mean, I think even in a rampier deck, I think this like still has applications. But I agree with you. It's almost certainly best in like proactive, like beat down a green decks. But I wouldn't be unhappy to put this in my ramp deck either.
No, and we mentioned that it has some anti-synergy with like your Questing Beast or your Ulven Walled Oddity, but putting a counter on those is honestly pretty great to begin with. They're already difficult to block, and they push so much damage. And going from 4 to 5 power is a big deal. It speeds up the clock by a full turn.
I guess we need to put Incubation Druid back in the cube. Anyway.
That does leave us with two additional green creatures here. One that I know Chris wants to talk about, and one that Teld is pretty high on. Chris, why don't you talk to us about this Hydra? Which, by the way, my Thunder Junction bingo card had a slot for a random Hydra/Phoenix, so this card got me a bingo square. But
nice.
You added this. I think yesterday was the last mythic that was spoiled from the main set.
Yeah, so this is Goldbane Hydra. It's X and a green for a 0/0 Hydra with Vigilance, Trample, and Haste, which is a really nasty combination of keywords. It enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it, just like, every other Hydra in history. And then when it dies, you create a number of tapped treasure tokens equal to its power. So, we'll have to discuss off air whether or not that something that comes in below the old vanilla test on stats is worth playing. Notably, if you top deck this with an arbitrarily large amount of mana, then, it has Vigilance, Trample, and Haste. That's going to flip a lot of tables on their head. And if you cast it early, let's say you spend 4 mana to make a 3/3 Vigilance, Trample, Haste, that's not a bad deal. It's not a great deal. I'd rather cast Questing Beast for that much mana, but it's not a bad deal. And if they trade with it in combat, then you just make 3 treasure tokens, which gets you up to be able to massively double spell or cast your 7-drop the following turn. So, obviously, if this was just X and a green, Hydra text, Vigilance, Trample, Haste, I don't think that on its own would push it over the edge for me. It's the fact that it refunds all but one of the mana that you spent on it when it dies. To me, that screams potential. And then later in the game, where generating that much mana doesn't matter, it's just an insane top deck, right?
Yeah, it gives me Shivan Devastator vibes, which is a card that you've traditionally liked. I've been traditionally low on. That one has flying. This one has Vigilance, Trample. So they're obviously not directly comparable. This one does something on the way out. That one doesn't. I can't help but think about this in that vein. But this is also a green card, so you're going to have more native ramp to pump out a bigger creature earlier. So I'm not sure where I land on this. It's very possible for the death trigger to not matter some games, and then it's possible that your opponent is just damned if they do, damned if they don't, because the treasure is so important for you to be able to just cast 2 big creatures. So
the Vigilance plus Trample plus Haste combo is just
a lot of words. It's a lot of keywords.
It's really
that's just gonna play so well, right? It's just a giant nuclear missile, cruise missile you're sending to your opponent, but it also blocks, and also they can't block it or can't kill it without giving you a bunch of value. It combos with the Brushwag we just spoiled. Also you
combos with Magda, right? You leave behind a bunch of treasures, turn them into 4/4 Scorpion Dragons.
I will also note that we have deliberately cut down on the number of green creatures that enter the battlefield and just draw more cards, because we've had to balance around blue a little bit. But, in combination with cards like Radagast, in combination with cards that, when they do damage, you, impulse your deck for more creatures or whatever else, the treasure making aspect of this card is going to be more relevant into the later game the more card advantage your green section has. So, like we talked about before, Magic is just functioning at this place right now where both players almost always have some resource. So I'm going to go on record and say that this isn't the most innovative text box in the world, but I think that this might actually be worth a test, to be honest with you, because if it trades for a creature and just refunds you so much of the tempo that you spent on it, that's pretty serious.
I bet this sees constructed play. If one of them dies, you just chain all of that treasure mana into the next one.
Oh my god!
It's like twice
Isn't
as
there
big,
also
right?
isn't there also a deck right now that like makes boatloads of mana and
Somebody sent a screenshot of floating like 200 mana, so I'm assuming there's something like that out there. And yeah, this is one of those, like, if you can make infinite mana, it just kills on the spot, like any haste X drop creature is going to. But yeah, we'll see. I think we should try this one out, give it its due diligence, and see how relevant all of the different lines of text are, which does piggyback into one final green creature here, one that I think Teld is really high on. This is also notably from the big score, the vault, whatever it's called. I don't know why it's in the vault, but it's in the vault.
apparently they stuffed a big dumb dinosaur inside the vault.
It was born in the vault, but I don't know why dinosaurs are being born in the vault. But anyway, enough lore. We've already talked about how Twitter feels about the lore. So, Vaultborn Tyrant.
Yeah, Vaultborn Tyrant is 5 green for a big dumb 6/6 dinosaur with trample. So it's got Dreadmaw stat line, which everyone knows, premium, best stat line in Magic. And when it ETBs, or another creature with power 4 or greater ETBs, you gain 3 life and draw a card. And then when it dies, if it's not a token, you create a token that is a copy of it, but it's an artifact in addition to its other types. So very big, very dumb, very resilient, pads your life total, finds you something else to play, guarantees that your big dumb green creatures draw you more cards and gain you more life. This card is probably obnoxious to play against. If you don't have Swords to Plowshares or something similar, it is just going to stabilize your board versus most spots, I think. It's not quite as stabilizing on the turn you play it as a Titan of Industry might be, because that card puts 2 bodies into play and gains you a little more life. But I think the long-term value is definitely there. It just has an ability to take over a game, right? If your opponent doesn't kill it or isn't able to get it completely out of play, that the token, you're just going to put a lot of stats into play, presumably. And your red opponent, even if they kill this, if they don't have like Incendiary Flow or something.
Yeah, the game's over for them.
Game's over, yeah.
I'm surprised this isn't a 5-drop. It just looks like the type of card I'd expect to see on a 5-drop.
Hey guys, I broke the card. So when your opponent targets it with Doomblade, you just copy it with 3 steps ahead. So it triggers off of itself dying.
That is very, very silly, yeah.
Anyway, I think this card is absolutely there on power level as a green 7-drop. Again, like, we're at a point in Magic where it's kind of like pick your poison with those. You've got Hornet Queen, you've got Titan, and now I think you also have this thing if you want to play. This is a really strong sneak attack target as well, especially if you can like sneak it and then play like another overstated creature on the same turn.
Or just sneaking 2 big dumb things out.
Yeah, I don't like this design as much as I like Titan, not because I am going to make the argument that like Titan is inherently more powerful or anything. I like that Titan stabilizes you harder the turn it comes down and has the modality to pop problematic artifacts and enchantments.
I value that a lot on Titan.
Yeah, it's
but
really good.
But this card is worth 7 mana.
For sure. If we wanted another 7-drop at 450, we could consider running this alongside Titan. I don't necessarily know that it should replace Titan, even though there are instances where it will notably be better than Titan of Industry. I don't think one of those cards is necessarily better or worse than the other. They do slightly different enough things, but yeah, it's a 7-drop that's there on power level. One more green spell. I'm assuming Teld added this to the list, and I was like, wow, this is such an insanely good Peasant Cube card. So I'm curious where you think it might lie in like the unrestricted card pool, but it has the potential to be incredibly powerful. So why don't you go ahead and take this one?
Yeah, so this is Trash the Town. It's another spree card. So it's got a base cost of green. And it's an instant. We can pay +2 to put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature. +1, target creature gains trample until end of turn. And +1 until end of turn, target creature gains whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw 2 cards. And at first, I was also on this is just a Peasant Cube card. But I gotta be real with you, the more I've thought about this card, like, I think there's just a million things going on here that is very powerful. Like, it's so flexible. all the modes are situationally awesome, and altogether the total package just seems, if you cast this for 5 mana, you're pretty happy to spend 5 mana doing that.
A lot of times the trample is kind of like the interesting one to me, because a lot of green cards just natively have trample, or like they're going unblocked or whatever anyway. But yeah, you can sneak in trample. You can even just tack that on to target your opponent's creature to commit a crime for cards that care about that. But I think the big selling point, if there is a selling point for me here, is 2 mana, draw 2 cards when the creature you target deals combat damage, which I find very annoying because it's a green 2 mana draw 2 and blue still can't get anything besides Charter Course.
Yeah, sometimes you keep a hand with like a 1 mana dork and, a couple of lands and a 4-drop, and you play the dork on 1, and we see it a lot where you just like attack on 2.
Yeah, you just attack with it. They played their tap land or whatever, and you just cycle this for 2 cards. Like, you're actually up cards in green off of an instant, which is kind of ridiculous. But I'm not sure where this fits. Obviously, the totality of the card adds up to something pretty strong, in the baseline of like 2 mana draw 2 is finicky because it requires a creature to deal combat damage. It's not like you can actually just cast it for 2 mana like you could Chart a Course or whatever like that. The thing that interests me is we don't play a lot of combat tricks in the unrestricted cube. I think we could stand to play 1 or 2 more just because it adds an extra layer to combat. And the 2+1/+1 counters is the type of thing that when there's only like 1 or 2 cards floating around in a cube, like that's something that people really have to consider. So I see the power level of the card. I see it as a peasant powerhouse that I'm not quite sure of for unrestricted cube, I think is where I'm at.
Yeah, I think I'd like to try this, but if it ends up being good, I think it's going to be just because it's a baseline 2 mana divination in green. I think that's going to be where it's really shining. Although the combat trick functionality of it, I like that. I like cards that add texture to Magic combat instead of just straight up blocks and maybe they have a Doomblade or something.
I think that it is interesting enough to test. I say this a bunch. If you're playing a Power Max 360 card Legacy cube, like, you don't have room for this. Yeah, I mean, they keep giving us like progressively more interesting green effects or more pushed versions of green effects that have existed for a long time, and I think we can certainly find room to test this. I would be lower on this card if like the draw 2 cards clause cost like 2 additional mana, because then sure. I think you're looking at 3 pretty bad deals. But the fact that like one of the modes is just like objectively pretty good. Right. With the other stuff tacked onto it is what makes this card like potentially interesting. I think we should test it.
I think the spree cards have all been, for the most part, designed as like very powerful cards.
I think when people start playing this set, I really think these spree cards are going to immediately jump up to like the top of near the top somewhere of the pick orders for a lot of colors, sure. At common, uncommon. They feel like they have so much play to them, especially if they're like this one and they have a mode that we're like a singular mode that we're pretty happy to click. Because the other spree cards that we looked at, we're kind of like, all right, these modes are like fine, but we really want to tag 2 of them. And this one, I'm just like, yeah, if I play this as a 2 mana divination, I'm probably happy.
So we have about 9 gold cards and 0 colorless cards to talk about here. So let's go ahead and move into the last leg of this review. Okay, quick note before we actually talk about these gold cards here. Chris had to make like an unsummon and bounce, so Chris will not be on the remainder of this recording, which is unfortunately because we were going to try to like bait him with a lot of these gold cards, but he's given his express approval to like talk shit about him and say that he just loves like all of these cards, and he actually went back and said his words that white card, that white like blink card is like the best white card in the cube and we should add it.
Yeah,
so.
He said that he had changed his mind. He had to think about it, but over the course of the episode, he wore down. He realized that spree is awesome and we should be playing it.
He also said D-Tutor sucks and D-Tutor's back in, Thoughtseize is gone. So I mean, real change of heart just out of nowhere, but he won't he won't be adding any more opinions to this, unfortunately. But I did want to mention there was a card here that I actually put to get his thoughts on, but one of the special guest slots in this set is Mystic Snake, which is an old-timey reprint, 1 green, blue, for a 2/2 flash creature. When it enters the battlefield, counter target spell. I put this on here because every set we get like that one glimmer of like blue-green flash being a thing, and I was like trying to bait Chris with it. But as Chris pointed out, which is absolutely true, like this is just not a card that holds up in modern Magic, especially with the restrictive mana cost. So
Yeah, I think for the sort of Mystic Snake style effect to hold up in Modern Magic, it really needs to look, maybe if it was some sort of like mana leak, but it also is a fireball. So maybe if it could like make your creature gigantic and then counter your opponent's spell, that way you could kill it. Maybe then we'd be getting somewhere with these blue-green counter spells.
Mm-hmm. He added a note here that like he mentioned with the Sphinx, flash plus flying is such a huge boon to like blue instant speed threats that we would really need a Mystic Snake that can actually engage in combat before we would consider it. And we're already not on Frilled Mystic. I think Mystic Snake's easily better than Frilled Mystic, but...
So what are we looking for, like Mystic Dove?
Yeah. No, just a flying snake. Make it like a Quetzalcoatl or something like that. Yeah, Mystic Snake's not making the cut, but it was something I wanted to point out there for that inevitable blue-green flash deck that'll come about in some sets. But we got another Simic card here. Teld, I want you to read this one because it has a lot of words on it.
Oh, Lord. Okay. So this is Bonnie Paul Clear Cutter. It's a reference to Paul Bunyan. So it is blue, blue, green, 3. So 6 total mana for a 6/5 giant scout with reach. When it enters the battlefield, you create Bo, a legendary blue ox creature token with this creature's power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control. So this makes somewhere in the realm of like 11 to 20 points of power when it enters play. But wait, there is more. When you attack, you can draw a card and then put a land card from your hand or graveyard onto the battlefield.
I didn't even see or graveyard.
Now, I have a couple of issues. Like, flavor-wise, this is a clear cutter, so why does this not let us sack lands like the Gitrog monster does to draw cards? Because that feels like it'd be much more thematically appropriate. I don't want to talk too much about this stupid card. It is a gigantic stat monster. It is completely egregious in terms of the amount of power to toughness it puts into play. And unironically, Chris does want to play it because, like memeing aside about him, like he did mention that this is the kind of messed up card that Simic usually doesn't get access to. We currently, I think, only have 2 Simic cards. We have Uro, which this feels sort of different but competing in a similar vein as Uro, and then Mother Goose, which has been Goose Mother, that has been a really, really solid performer.
I think this card's egregious. I am not a fan of 2 big creatures tied to 1 card because when it resolves, it's just like, oh, the game's over. Plus, I absolutely hate that this is just a generic attack trigger. It doesn't even have to be the creature that attacks. So you can play it and then attack with something that was attack with your Gilded Goose and get just a free card draw. It's like the old Simic cards from like 2-3 years ago where every Simic card was doing the same thing, and I just think like the stats are ridiculous. I'm also like I have the like limited bias in my head where like you can't beat this card in limited. It also has Reach, which is arguably better than Trample on cards like this. So I think this is super egregious. The stats you get for the mana you pay in a color that's able to ramp into it on top of like card draw and ramp. It's just everything I dislike about Simic card design.
Also, when you get the token, even if you ramp into it, as you play more lands, this token gets bigger because it's a persistent effect. There's a lot about this card I do not like, and I agree with you. This is the kind of limited bomb that I'm assuming that if blue-green is like blue-green often is, this is going to be one of those cards that when your opponent has like blue-blue, like when you see your opponent playing blue and green mana in their deck, you just like assume that this is in their deck, kind of like Azoni was in MKM with green-black. Would have drastically preferred if this had been a mythic.
I just don't like... Oh, it's not even mythic, Jesus. I don't like the... Like, Quintorius Loremaster is another card that I'm kind of like... I don't like cards that make a ton of stats over multiple bodies. And we talked in the last Murders at Karlov Manor review about Tulsamir. I don't think we actually mentioned it in the review, but it's another card that's like... gold, kind of mana intensive, but makes like a giant body plus like another body that's doing something relevant. I'm just not a fan of those cards because if you don't answer it with a counter spell, you end up getting 2 for 1, and then if you don't 2 for 1 yourself and you just don't have the answer, it just runs away with the game. So we'll hear what Chris has to say about it as far as like playing it in the queue, but I think the card is egregious. I didn't even realize it could grab a land from the graveyard. Not that like changes that much, but it's just added utility, more things. Like the fact that it does not have to attack. I think this card would have been a lot cooler if it says when an Ox you control attacks, do blah blah blah, because then it like plays into itself. It doesn't give you immediate value. Maybe the Ox could have been like a static 3/3 or something, and not a 8/8.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised this doesn't just gain you life on top of it. Like, I'm sort of surprised that they just didn't add and gain 1 life onto this.
Gain 3 life,
because,
maybe back in 2021 when every card did that, but that's probably enough on Bonnie Paul here. You added Breaches to the list. Breaches is finally blue. He's been red both times, but now he's blue-red. You like this card?
Yeah, I like this a lot better than the other Breaches. So this Breaches is 1 blue-red for a 3/3 with Menace. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, you may sacrifice an artifact. If you do, flip a coin. When you win the flip, copy the spell. You may choose new targets for the spell. When you lose the flip, it deals damage equal to the spell's mana value to any target. So this is kind of a heads I win, tails you lose kind of flip, where both sides of the flip are going to be good for you. I think that it's kind of neat that it's like this like moderately aggressive card that also has some cool value generation and rewards you for playing like your eggs and all that sort of stuff. I don't know. It's just cool. Also, I really love the art. It's like Breaches hanging on a rail line, setting up some dynamite. Breaches' whole thing in this set on a couple of different cards is just him being obsessed with explosives, and I'm just vibing it.
There's something blowing up in the background. I mean, sacrifice an artifact kills this for unrestricted cube, but in any environment where artifacts are actually a thing going on, this probably does a little bit extra. Notably, also, like it says whenever you cast your second spell, it doesn't specify instant or sorcery or anything like that. So you could go like cheap spell into creature and copy that creature spell and make another copy of that creature. Or, the fallback of just doming your opponent for damage. It's usually only going to be like 1, 2, 3 damage, but that's usually enough to clear something off the board. I'm not a huge fan of coin flip cards where both sides of the coin are like just beneficial and you don't really care what the result is, but
I think it is thematically appropriate.
Yeah, it makes sense. Plus, like, this is clearly built for Commander because, like, blue-red coin flip is, like, a thing that the designers at Wizards love, so.
Yeah, having a loaded coin or, like, a trick coin just feels very much like a little Western gimmick. It's like, it doesn't, we're not actually flipping a coin here. We're just winning no matter what we do.
All right, we've got a Selesnya card here, and notably, I mentioned at the top of the episode, we could have talked about Selvala as well, which I think is also just a generically powerful Selesnya card. So Selesnya is getting a little bit of power here. We don't actually have Selvala on the list, but this one is Seraphic Steed. What is this, French? I'm going to brush up on my French here, but it's green-white for a 2/2. I believe it is a unicorn mount, and it has saddle 4. It has a lifelink and first strike, and when it attacks, if it was saddled, you make a 3/3 flying angel. Did I get that right? I'm trying to go
yes.
off of the French that's on this card here.
Yeah, you did. You got it correct. Good job.
So just to parse that out, saddle 4 is huge, so you're not going to be able to do this every time, but there are 4 power creatures that come down on turn 3, like Bloated Contaminator. You mentioned Blade Splicer puts 4 power on board, but it's a 2-mana 2/2 first strike lifelink, which can rumble decently, doesn't get through everything, and then if it attacks while saddled, just spit out a 3/3 flyer. That's it.
Yes,
that's the whole card, which sometimes it won't do anything, and sometimes this will make a 3/3 flyer for free every single turn.
Yeah, I think this card seems obnoxious because I think the like first strike lifelink line is also the perfect vessel for putting counters on with stuff like the Brushwag we mentioned earlier, Luminarch Aspirant, Bone Splitter even. I think the baseline is incredible. It's great against aggressive decks. And then once you start saddling it, I mean, it is ogre. It is all ogre.
Tristani, notably the newer Tristani is notably a 3-mana 4/4 in these colors. So just can you imagine the Tristani plant people like jumping on the back of this unicorn, like, go get them?
I guess the question is this a card we're interested in? Because I feel like this card is very powerful, like extremely powerful.
This is exactly to me like a Feast or Famine card where either you're not crewing it and then it's like, okay, it's like a fine little ground beater, or you are crewing it and it's taken on, I'm saying crew like unironically, but it just takes over the game if it's not dealt with. I don't know. I don't actually think this card is that interesting. I think it's just kind of like one of those big, like, scratch my head, why are the numbers so big on this card? But if this card just said, like, it made a 1/1 token and the crew cost, or like the saddle cost was like 2 or something, like I wouldn't bat an eyelash at it and I'd still think it'd be pretty powerful, but it just spits out 3/3 flyers. It's like Perhelion, but on a 2-mana card,
Yeah, I'm not super interested in testing this just because of all the reasons you mentioned. I just felt like we had to do our due diligence, because if you're playing a like kind of power maxi environment, this is the sort of card that could break that hurdle.
Yeah, I mean, this is another one of those like win the game limited cards too, which is usually an indication that like it's something that could be considered for a power max cube. Obviously, you're not playing this in like vintage cube or anything, but in our environment, I imagine it could be pretty strong. We have a lot of creatures that can come down with 4 power on turn 3 and just saddle it right away. So we'll get Chris's thoughts on that one at a different time. You added Chemball to this list.
Yeah, so we have Chemball, Profiteering Mayor. It is 1 white-black for a 2/4 legendary human advisor. And when 1 or more tokens enter the battlefield under your opponent's control, for each of them, you create a tap token that is a copy of it. This ability triggers once per turn. And whenever 1 or more tokens enter the battlefield under your control, you drain each opponent for 1. I don't necessarily think this is for us, but I did want to mention it because it feels like a pretty powerful hate bear effect. There's a lot of tokens that show up in cubes these days. It's got a pretty decent defensive stat line to buy you time. It's the kind of obnoxious card that's just going to really frustrate your opponent. And as you generate the value with it, you're going to get to drain them. Just making tokens is so common these days that I have to assume this is triggering several times a game against most decks if it sits in play.
I think this is a cool card. I think it's way more interesting than the Teza that we added from Murders at Karlov Manor, which is not a card that I think is super powerful in the unrestricted environment, but it's fine. I think this is way cooler, and it's not that tokens need like explicit hate more than this card is just good to play in a token-based strategy, which Black-White is more than capable of doing because you get drain on tokens. And then you will incidentally get tokens. Like, this card just like completely swamps a planeswalker like Vivian, you know, which spits out a 3/3, and you're like, okay, I'll go ahead and make a 3/3 as well. Or there's probably other big token makers that we're not even like considering. Like your opponent plays
5 mana Teferi.
Yeah, 5 mana Teferi, make a token, which you kind of have to do. It's like, okay, I'll make a token and drain you for 1 as well, and now I have that. Plus, one thing that's really cool about this is there are a lot of white cards that are gated, like the power of the cards are gated by giving your opponent a token. So think like Skyclave Apparition or Fateful Absence or Get Lost. Like if you get lost to your opponent's creature, they make 2 map tokens, you will also make 2 map tokens. And you get them in batches, right? If your opponent makes multiple tokens at once, you get all of those tokens, even though the ability only triggers once each turn. If there's one big batch of tokens coming down, you also get a big batch of tokens, which I imagine, like, if this was in, say, your standard cube or the Pockets cube or something like that, and someone casts Herd Migration, like, it's like, okay, I will also Herd Migration, and you will lose 5 life. And this is all without mentioning, like, if you have this plus Jadar on board or something, right? Like you're just draining your opponent for 1 for free every turn. So it also has that magic toughness 2/4. I really want to avoid a world where every creature in the cube is a 2/4, but they just keep putting that stat line on every 3 drop. So
I think there's also some interesting, this leads to some interesting sequencing decisions on your opponent's part of like, you have things of like, how do I play my Blade Splicer without giving you, like, is there a way I can give you something less good than a 3/3 token? Or like I've got Starnheim suspended. Is there a way I can like make a token first with like a Thraben Inspector, right? That way I can now make 2 angels and not give you an angel.
Yeah, exactly. Like, and that's not going to come up often. And honestly, it's the type of thing that like it'll come up so infrequently that your opponent might not even be thinking about the sequencing when it could come up. But yeah, I like cards that just piggyback off of what your opponents do. It's a little awkward that, like, if you just get paired against, like, Selesnya or something, and it's like, yeah, don't mind if I do just, like, randomly hate on the entire theme of your deck or whatever. Like, that's a little bit annoying, but I do think the overall effect of this card is quite cool.
Yeah, it's very cool. I don't know if it'll end up replacing Teysa in our environment because I think that card is just more generically fine, but I think it's also kind of boring and it's played out reasonably well, I guess. But I think this card is very cool.
I'm gonna push to either try this out or the new uncommon that sacks a creature to destroy a permanent over Teysa. I do not like Teysa that much, but you've got another one on the list. Are you gonna sing it or no?
Oh, you know it, Roxanne. All right, that was my horrible intentionally.
Was that the police? All right, talk to me about Roxanne.
Yeah, so this is Roxanne. You don't have to drop that meteorite. You know, You could applaud me later. So it's Roxanne Starfall Savant. It's a 5 mana, so 3 red green for a 4/3. Whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you create a tapped, colorless artifact token named Meteorite, and it does the Meteorite thing of deal 2 and taps for mana of any color. And whenever you tap an artifact for mana, you add 1 mana of any type of mana that artifact token could produce. So it is kind of a repeatable small ball flame tongue Kavu, generates mana, stabilizes your board. Yeah, and then it can pick off opponent creatures as you attack with it. It can set up attacks where you like ping something and now they have to block with their big creature. It also is literally an alchemy card.
Yeah, like, just because it doesn't say it conjures a meteorite doesn't mean that this isn't just making a meteorite on the battlefield, which is an actual Magic the Gathering card. But this is a weird card, first off. Like, aesthetically, it does not feel like it fits with everything else in the set. It's a cat druid, but it's a Gruul card, which is weird. Like, it conjures an actual named card on the battlefield, which I always think is kind of cool. It's also just probably just, like, generically strong, right? It basically says when it attacks or ETBs deal 2 damage to any target, and then it just gives you a bunch of extra mana. It works with treasures. It makes your treasures sack for an additional color as well, or an additional mana. So, I mean, 5 mana, 4/3 is a pretty bad stat line, but if you can snipe something off the battlefield with that first meteorite, it probably justifies itself. Other than that, like, just an altogether very strange looking card to me.
Yeah, this feels like the kind of card that's probably low-key super powerful in the ramp version of Gruul that I like to draft a lot. Just because that deck, you want a card like this that puts a body into play, pings something off so your opponent's attacks are worse, and then also gets you more mana towards your, Escape to the Wild, Kogel and Yodaro, or your 7-drops, or things like that. The extra mana is so relevant. The body is going to be relevant. Like, just a really powerful card, I think. I could be wrong on this. It's probably worse against control, but like against creature decks, which is most of our cube, this is pretty powerful, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's significantly worse against control because it dies to bolt. Like, it leaves behind a meteorite. Notably, those artifacts do not tap for additional mana if Roxanne is no longer on the battlefield, and it only applies to artifact tokens. So if you have like a Mind Stone or whatever, that does not tap for additional mana either. But your opponent can line up an Essence Scatter against this just fine, or a Lightning Bolt against this just fine, and you get your 2-for-1. 2-for-1 on a 5-drop's perfectly fine. So this isn't a matter of, like, is the power level there? It's a question of, like, would we cut a card from our Gruul section to play this? And I'm not 100% sure. So we do have 3 additional cards. I accidentally miscategorized one of these, but that's fine. I'll get it at the end because it's probably the card I'm most excited about. But the next one up here was a suggestion that Chris wanted to go over, so I'll go ahead and do my best to adopt Chris's persona for this one. But Pillaged the Bog is black-green for a rare sorcery. Look at the top X cards of your library, where X is twice the number of lands you control. Put one of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom. And that's the whole effect of the card, so it's just digging really deep for card selection. And then it also has plot for 1 black-green, but as we discussed off air, like, this is one of those cards that you're just never plotting it unless you have literally nothing else to do with your mana, right? It's not worth spending turn 3 to dig deeper on this card later in the game, I don't think, unless you literally just don't have anything else to do, in which case you might just fire this off anyway on that turn to, like, try and hit a 1-drop or something. So it is interesting for Golgari. Golgari doesn't get a lot of cards, and in the late game, this is going to be very similar to a tutor. Also worth mentioning, this is, I think, very clearly based on that Assemble the Team alchemy card, which is like, look at the top third of your library for a card and put it in your hand. I think this is another adaptation of an alchemy card.
Yeah, and by the time you're at like five lands in play, I think this is functionally that or better.
Yeah, look at 10 cards in your 25 card deck or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, so this is going to be kind of a soft tutor. Cantrips that cost more than 1, we've seen really need to have some substantial upside. Everybody knows that I love Invasion of Ixalan because of that. But I think the number of cards that this looks at is probably going to be enough to get there. It's just so many cards.
Yeah, I mean, there's like a gradient, right, of like cantrip to tutor on opposite sides, and like the more you cantrip or the more selection you get, the closer you get to the tutor side. And this is like, I think, closer to being demonic tutor than it is to being Elvish Farsight or just
Right.
a normal green cantrip or something like that. Though, I mean, it's not splashy, which I like. I kind of wish this, like, could put a card or two in your graveyard, perhaps, just to make it feel a little more Golgari-ish and not just like a mono black card or whatever. I guess the lands part is adding the green to this. Plot doesn't really sway me one way or another, but I like simplicity. So, you know, I think this is a fine card we're going to test out.
It would have been super wordy, but I kind of wish if you cast it when it was plotted, you got to put some number of cards in the graveyard. I think that would have been a cool way to add a reason to plot, especially plotting at a higher mana cost. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt that there's a reason that this doesn't plot for black-green. I guess it would just be that you could just set up bigger turns very, very efficiently if it were doing that. But I don't actually understand why this card needs to have plot at all, to be totally honest. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, like, the design makes sense, right? It's like, oh, I can, on a later turn, I can dig super deep and have all my mana open to cast the most expensive thing I find. But, like, on an actual play perspective, it's like, right. I would be fine just casting this straight up most of the time anyway. So.
Yeah, this sort of feels like the kind of thing that's, like, too cute by half, I believe is the way you say it. It's like, it's just a little too cute. Like, it's very designer brained where you're, like, thinking about all the cool stuff you could do with it and not really thinking about how it'll play out. But again, as we've mentioned multiple times, having the option to plot it is just pure upside. There's no downside to it because you know what your play pattern with it will be, right? So pure upside, I'm not going to complain too much. It's just a little weird.
Yeah, for sure. I've got two more cards on this list that I added last night that I want to talk about. One of them I think is like a little more cutesy than it deserves. The other one I was hoping Chris would be here because I actually want to convince him to play it. But
you've convinced me. Like the more we talked about it, we'll get to it. We'll
save it. The first one is Rakdos Joins Up, which is 3 black-red for a legendary enchantment. There's actually a cycle of legendary enchantments across a bunch of different weird color pairs that are like in line with all of Oko's crew and stuff, and they do like really janky things, but this one is a legendary enchantment that says, when Rakdos Joins Up enters the battlefield, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield with 2 additional +1/+1 counters on it. And then it has this rider text that says, whenever a legendary creature you control dies, Rakdos Joins Up deals damage equal to that creature's power to target opponent. So 5 mana reanimation, traditionally not been good. Even with the 2 +1/+1 counters, it's usually not great, though I do think it's more manageable at that point, because even if you're getting back like a 3-drop or something, it's usually going to have the stat line that puts it on par with like a 5 mana stat line that you could be casting from your hand. So if you get back like, I don't know, your Legion War Boss for this, right? Having a 4/4 Legion War Boss, I think, is probably worth 5 mana, even
Imagine
though,
getting breaches back with this?
yeah, 5/5 breaches. The thing I do like is that the legendary text doesn't seem like a complete miss and can actually be quite powerful. For example, in our Rakdos section, we have 4 Rakdos cards, and 3 of them are legendary creatures. you know, granted, one of them's like Prosper, so you only get a point of damage. One of them's Zoila, so you only get 2 damage. But one of them's Kroxa, which if you cast while Rakdos Joins Up is on board, like, your opponent just immediately takes 6 on top of the Kroxa trigger. If you're able to escape Kroxa at some point, and like they can't just ignore it, they have to kill it, they just take 6 again. We might be a little light on legendary creatures. There are 11 total that I counted between red, black, and the Rakdos section. That might be a little bit too few, but I do think there are enough incidental legends that just kind of make it into decks at this point, that make it into cubes, because they tend to be some of the more pushed cards, that there might be a point where this card is actually interesting to play as just 5 mana reanimation with some upside that's going to burn your opponent throughout the course of a game.
Can you imagine playing this, reanimating the Kroxa in your graveyard, doming your opponent for, 8? And then casting an Unearth? And just doming them for 6 more? Yeah,
just Unearth Kroxa, take another 6, you know, like... I like the extra burn damage that this puts on top of the reanimation. I think, to quote us, apparently, using the whole Buffalo, you know...
Definitely
I think
us,
if you can, definitely us and not Words of Limited or anything. But if you can get value out of that consistently, I think this card is quite strong. It might not be there for us. And I also wanted to mention Wiley Beckert. She started doing art, I think, back in like Zendikar Rising, maybe even before that. But she's one of my favorite artists at this point, and she did all of these legendary enchantments for this set.
Yeah, one interesting thing about this card with the damage is that, 5 mana is a ton for reanimation. I don't know if we'd make it into the deck, but like the damage this card does plays into what a lot of our legends are already doing. So like Inti, Jadar, Vrain, Kari Zev, Breaches, these are all fairly aggressive cards that want to be attacking, Rankle. And so like it's not inconceivable to see a world where this is just, you know, you're reanimating something, you're putting power, a bunch of extra power to play, but it's a legendary creature, a Kari Zev or something that died. And the number of legendary creatures you're playing in your deck that's like trying to kill your opponent here is just going to make their life really, really miserable because it just kills them from such a high life total potentially.
This was the card I was mentioning is really good with Calamity too, right? You use this on Calamity, it comes back as a 6/8 with haste. It's a legendary creature, so if it dies, they take 6, and then you get to copy some other creatures, and you know, I thought that would be pretty sweet. But yeah, I like this card. It might not, it's almost definitely not there for us and wouldn't take the spot of any of our current Rakdos cards, but I think there's something here. It's a push in the right direction for reanimation with upside at this cost, because normally when you see 5 mana reanimated creature, it's just like, we're off of it, we're not doing that. The last card on our list today is Tywakeen, Perfect Shot. I believe Tywakeen, not 100% sure. I don't think this is a returning character. I think this is just a new character, but I might be wrong about that.
They have a gun.
No, that's not a gun. That's a Halo lightsaber not gun. Tywakeen is red-white for a 2/3. It is a rare legendary human mercenary. And it says, whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to a creature equal to that creature's toughness, draw a card. And it has the activated ability of X, tap. If a source you control would deal non-combat damage to a permanent or player this turn, it deals that much damage plus X instead. So there's actually a lot to unpack here, and you have to read the text very carefully. So first off, 2 mana, 2/3, I think gets thumbs up for Boros. I think that's, like, if this was a 1/1 or something, we wouldn't consider it. But it has the starting stat line that we would want for a Boros deck. Second off, it turns any source of non-combat damage to your opponent's creatures into card draw if you hit them, like, exactly on the mark, which is really cool flavor text for like a sharpshooter who always hits their mark, right? Like, you deal exact damage is like you got the headshot or whatever, you know?
Right.
I think that's super cool. But you can't deal excess damage. It's not like that. But if your opponent's creature has 3 toughness and you cast Lightning Strike on it, you just draw a card from dealing exact damage to them, which is already great. Like, if that lines up, like, it won't line up all the time. Sometimes you shock your opponent's X1, but if they play even like Thraben Inspector and you just shock it off while this is on board, you just draw a card. But then the activated ability is what really caught my attention. So the thing to note here is you do not have to target a source. It just applies to all of your sources for the turn. So an example of this is like, you pay, let's just say you pay 2 mana and tap this. It means any non-combat damage you do to a permanent or player this turn adds 2 damage to it. So you can do something like pay 2 on turn 4, cast a shock to deal 4 damage to something, and then cast another shock to deal 4 damage to something else. Or cast your Lightning Strike and deal 5 to you, which is, first off, it lets you modulate the damage that your spells do to line it up with the first ability, right? If your opponent has an X5 on board and you just have like a Lightning Strike in hand, you say, okay, I need to add 2 damage to this Lightning Strike. I will go ahead and tap this for 2. I'll Lightning Strike your 5 toughness creature, kill it, and draw a card. Which is insane in my opinion. It means that all of your burn spells become fireballs, right? Because this lets you just tap for whatever the difference is that you need. Plus, you can do things like, oh, I have shock in my hand. My opponent's at 13. They're playing control or something like that, so they're not putting creatures on board. I will just dump all of my mana this turn into Tywakeen and then shock you for like 7 or 8 off of my 1 spell. I won't draw a card because I'm not hitting a creature, but this card is very flexible. And then the last thing I want to mention is this card is insanely broken with Goblin Bombardment on 2 levels. First off, if you just have a bunch of expendable creatures and your opponents have a bunch of 1 toughness creatures, you can go Goblin Bombardment, shoot your thing for 1, draw a card. Goblin Bombardment this, shoot your thing for 1, draw a card. But if you pay, like, let's say you pay 5 mana for Tywakeen for a turn, it means every activation of Goblin Bombardment deals 6 damage, and you could just go sack my board, kill you. Because it does not, the activated ability applies to all of the non-combat damage. Like, you could activate this for 3, And then +1 your Chandra, Torch of Defiance, hit a land, and deal 5 to your opponent off of that trigger, which you would have to do before you plus Chandra. But this just turns all excess mana you have into damage while also drawing cards basically off of all of your burn spells because you can just modulate them to the point they need to be at.
Yeah, this card is... I skimmed it at first, and I thought it seemed cool, but probably not quite good enough, because I kind of skimmed it, as Magic players do, of, all right, we deal Xyz's damage, we draw a card, and then when we cast a spell, we can modulate it with mana, which, like, sure, that's fine. Even though that's going to be typically how this effect plays, the ability to do that and then get multiple effects out of it is kind of wild. Like, Goblin Bombardment, Inferno Titan really stick out, stuff like Glorybringer potentially even, where you maybe you need an extra point of damage to get over the hump to kill something. But on top of that, the burn spells, drawing cards off your burn that's great.
Yeah,
that's so
sometimes good. You will just play this on 2, your opponent will play Land of War Visionary, you'll shock it and draw a card.
Yeah.
That's not even using the sometimes it will just line up that your burn spells draw you card. Like your opponent attacks you with a 5/5 and you Witchstalker Frenzy and draw a card. That's pretty... I think this card is pretty nutty, even though it does require, burn spells to work. It does work with fight spells, too, but you have to line those up, hyper-specifically to make them matter.
This sort of falls into... I'm actually really excited about this card to test it, because this is the kind of card that I really wanted in a deck that I like to play, which is like a Boros mid-range deck. So not exactly aggro, but playing a lot of burn spells, a lot of cheap removal, and then playing really efficient and powerful, 2, 3, 4 mana threats, right? And that's a version of Boros that not a lot of people play, but it's this much more control-y Boros. And this is the kind of card that lets you break parity with all that 1-for-1 removal before you start slamming your threats. And it scales up your removals of late game. You draw it. You can, obviously kill bigger things, go face. This card's real good. I was a little hesitant at first, but the more I think about it, I think this card is excellent.
The real way to break the card is with something that deals repeatable damage in the turn. So I would think something like a Thermo Alchemist, where you pay 2 additional mana into this and then you just Thermo Alchemist a couple times in the turn. We don't have a million cards like that in our cube that are just sending burn damage at face outside of actual burn spells. But there are a few. First off, in the 450 we have Rampaging Ferocidon, which, can you imagine someone casts a token maker and you're okay, in response I'm gonna pay 4 mana into this creature, and then your Ferocidon's gonna make you take 5 for every creature that enters the battlefield. Yeah, I mean, I don't need to go into more details about little mini combos. I could even see it being so strong that, we couldn't play this in conjunction with Goblin Bombardment, because it's just game over with those 2 cards a decent amount of the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think long-term, I said this when we got it, I think long-term Goblin Bombardment was going to end up being a problematic card, and cards like this are kind of not what I expected when I made that statement, but I do sort of feel like the card is unbelievably miserable to play against and also fairly powerful. And this is just another one of those cards that's there's going to be games where you play Goblin Bombardment, you dump 3 mana into this, and then sack 4 things that you had on board already.
You deal 16 to you. Yeah. This can be the last creature too. Yeah, so Tai Joaquin is a card that I'm really high on right now, just because I think it leads to really cool scenarios. But let's go ahead and get into some, just real quick, our overall impressions of the set, maybe favorite cards, favorite mechanics, things that don't hit for you. Unfortunately, we don't get Chris's take on this, but I'm assuming Chris is happy that we're just getting 2 really strong blue cards in this set, and then the rest is we're happy to play unique effects and things like that. But
he's always happy to get a good 1 mana recursive dork too. I'm sure.
Oh yeah, I mean, just two black 1-drops and good blue playable cards. He's got to be at least happy, even if he doesn't care about the aesthetics of the set or anything. He's got to be happy that we got at least those things. But for myself, I would say that this is clearly a Lost Caverns of Ixalan set where the creatures and the stat lines are just ridiculous. We mentioned twice in this episode already that the vanilla test is dead. We looked at a 3 mana 3/3 reach with a bunch of upside, and as much as I like that card, somebody in this call was able to say that they don't really care about that card, which is just a clear indication that the vanilla test needs to be reconsidered. It's not enough to be a 3 mana 3/3 or a 4 mana 4/4. You have to keep up with the change in stat lines across all of the different threats and all the different colors that are just increasing. The aesthetic of the set, it's a goofy ass world. I think that's cool. I do get that people complained a little bit that they dredged up like every single legend from every set that we know about, that like some of them I'm like, was this person even a bad guy in the first place? I don't know. But I get that people are like, there's too much of that. But outside of that, I think they did a good job. And I see the designers having fun. Like, there's like Lone Shark and there's like Bovine Intervention. I'm like, I like this stuff personally.
Holy cow.
Holy cow. Maybe I need to just get off Magic Twitter is the thing and just enjoy things and not worry about how other people perceive it. And as far as mechanics go, I think plot is interesting for gameplay purposes, but not really like that thematic, and I don't think it's actually going to come up in Cube that often. I think the spree cards look absolutely like insanely busted, and I'm excited for those. And then most of the like flavor mechanics like saddle, crimes, outlaws, they're all dorky to me. Like they're just super dorky. I don't foresee ever seeing them outside of this set or this setting. But those are also the things I would have guessed would have been here in the first place, right? When they're like, we're going to the Wild West with villains, I'm like, okay, there's probably going to be like bandits, vigilantes, there's going to be horses that you jump on, people are going to be committing crime. Like, this is exactly the stuff I expected. So I would say the set meets expectations, even though I think maybe they went a little bit too far with the whole Omen paths. Oh, look, it's this person. Oh, look, John Cena's here, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think this looks like a crazy powerful set. I will say up front, though, even the commons and uncommons look super pushed, and the rares are just mind-blowing. Like, a lot of the like we mentioned, there's a number of cards, like several double digits worth of cards that we didn't talk about that we could have talked about that are just good. There's a bunch of cards that are situationally super powerful that like require a little bit of work but are insane. So that being said, this gave me this is almost exactly what I wanted from Magic, right? I don't think Magic tells good stories. I think they need to give up on trying to tell serious stories at this point. Clearly, whether it's because we live in an unserious culture or because we, the writers are out of ideas or whatever, Magic stories haven't been good in a long time. Let's just be honest about it. So I would rather them embrace the like fun, goofy aesthetic and just like have fun with design, have fun with these cards, make punny names. Like, don't take yourself too seriously and don't give us a serious, like if this had been a very serious Western trying to tell, a very specific kind of story, like, are there companies that I would love to see that? Sure, FromSoft gave me like a hardcore, Western game that's trying to tell this really dark story. I'd be all for it, right? There's a number of companies I'd be cool with that. But WotC isn't a serious company. Like they make a children's game and they clearly are marketing it to younger people. Just have fun with it. This is what I wanted. Like, flavor's awesome. It's 10 out of 10. It's got cut tons of gimmicks and like it's cool. I enjoyed it. I've been looking forward to this set and it paid off. Like I'm really vibing the hats. I do have to worry where our stat line's going to be in 2 years though.
Who knows? White 4/2. There's a 4-mana white 4/2 at uncommon, which just always feels weird when I see a 4/2 in white. It just doesn't feel right, but it's not like it's even good or anything.
Yeah, I have to wonder like how close are we to like, would a 1-mana 3/1 even be like pushed?
I don't know. Speaking of which, we didn't talk about the card because it's not very good, but this is the first time we've ever gotten a 1 in a blue 2/2 with no downside. There's a newt that you can saddle and like if it hits your opponent, it flashbacks. That is the first ever 1 in a blue 2/2 with no downside. I mean, everything is going up, and that's not like revolutionary or anything, but it is a sign that like creature stats are better and are going to continue to be better.
Also, we mentioned the Bronco clearly had death touch at some point. I am almost positive this newt at some point had flying, because if you look at the art, it appears to be leaping over like islands from island to island. It's like clearly gliding. Mm-hmm. So I'm almost positive that card at some point had flying.
Last note on the flavor and story, I will just ask people, like, it is okay to say you don't like something without calling the people who designed it lazy. Like, I feel really bad for the people who put so much effort into designing sets like this for people to say that it is lazy. That is my least favorite thing. Sometimes Magic does lazy things, but you are discrediting all the work that went into something like this because it's not for you. It's not lazy. It's just not what you expected or not what you wanted. And it's okay for you to not like things. If you like the gritty atmosphere, maybe stay away from Bloomborough for like a couple months. But right after that, you're going to get this Duskmorn, everybody's getting stabbed in the face set. Like, if this isn't for you, there will eventually be something for you. And I'm just not going to buy into all of the Twitter nonsense about this. This set delivered, I believe, what they advertised they were going to deliver, and
Absolutely.
I enjoy it personally. So that's where I stand on that.
Yeah, I think this worked a lot better for me than a set like SNC, where I felt like they were in the middle of trying to tell like kind of a serious story and then just did it. And so like cards like Sizzling Soloist and all of the various punny cards there, Sleeping with the Fishes, that didn't work for me because I felt like SNC was like still part of what was attempting to be a serious story. And this one, like I said, the whole Kellen arc has just been like lighthearted, goofy fun, and throwing Kellen into different situations. And, you know, not everything, I think one thing to remember is not everything needs to be this like amazing, wonderful 95% Metacritic score type of storytelling. It's okay for things to just be goofy and fun and like trying to, you know,
it's a game. It's a game. Like, I get people like the lore, but it is a game. At the end of the day, I want to have fun, and I think these cards are fun, and it shows that the designers had fun making them.
Agreed.
All right, let's close this out. So thanks as always to everyone listening. Remember, the best way to support the Jank Tank podcast and Jank Diver Gaming is to join our Discord server. Come draft with us. Give us your feedback, especially when these new sets come out. We want to know what worked, what didn't work, what we missed, what we were too high on, so on and so forth. The Discord is a great place to hang out with like-minded individuals, talk about Retail Limited, which will pop off in that first week it releases, and talk about all things Magic. You can find links to our Discord server wherever you're listening to this podcast. We have scheduled drafts 4 days a week, unrestricted cube drafts, which was the focus of our reviews for this episode. Those happen on Sunday and Wednesday nights. Peasant cube drafts on Saturday nights. F&M style drafts picked from a couple of different cubes that we vote on happen on Friday nights, obviously. And we have various Jank Diver Gaming Evergreen cubes and guest cube slots on Saturday and Sunday mornings. You can find us on social media, where I will be defending Outlaws at Thunder Junction while everybody else poo-poos it. You can find us on Twitter at JankDiverGaming, youtube.com/JankDiverGaming, and you can find Teld streaming on twitch.tv/TeldTalk. So that was our big review of Thunder Junction. We do not yet have it in mind what we're going to talk about for future episodes. This was the big one we knew was coming up. So thanks as always for listening, and we will catch all you lovely listeners next time.
Holy cow.
I mean, you could totally marry an enabler.
Have children. You'll be too tired and busy to have an existential crisis.
Giddy up, giddy up, giddy up.
Yeehaw!
Isolate the will not wear a bib gene.
Hellspur Posse Boss.
No, Chris is back. It's too late. Hold it.
Giddy up.
That's the whole point of Easter is ham.
Roxanne!